The Persuaders, Season 1, Claude Hopkins, The Birth of Proof. Episode 1, The Man Who Knew the Numbers. Claude's finger hovered over the edge of the ledger. "I have something to say," he said louder this time. Cutting through the chatter in the meeting room, the voices stopped. A dozen heads turned, some frowned. Others smirked. Mr. Halden raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated. "Yes, Mr. Hopkins?" Claude stood, his heart thudded in his chest. The numbers swam in his mind, numbers that didn't lie, even if no one wanted to hear them before speaking. Claude took a deep breath and wondered to himself, how did I end up at odds with everyone in this room, even my own boss? It had started like any other day for Claude. The office was never quiet at the Bissell Carpet Sweeper Company. Men moved back and forth across the wooden floor, their voices rising in laughter and casual talk. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped, and the air felt busy with excitement. Claude sat at his desk near the side of the room, his head bent over a ledger. He was checking the numbers from the company's recent advertisement, the same ad everyone else seemed to be talking about. "Did you see the new ad?" one salesman asked, waving a newspaper in his hand. "Yes," the other replied with a grin. "It's amazing. One of the best ads Bissell has ever run." Claude didn't look up. His attention remained on the neat columns of figures in front of him. He tried to understand the reason behind the smiles and cheerful voices around him. Nearly everyone in the office seemed pleased, proud of the advertisement, certain it was a success. But the numbers in Claude's ledger told a quieter story. Claude's attention stayed on the open ledger as he tried to understand what real advantage the advertisement had brought to the company. It was true that the current ad was one of the most expensive Bissell had ever run, but the numbers showed no real gain. People now knew the company had produced a fine advertisement, but that alone did not convince Claude. In his mind, success meant something different. Claude believed the company should earn more money than it spent on advertising. Only then could an ad be called successful. Yet no one else in the office seemed to care about that. They were pleased simply because the ad looked impressive. That was enough for them. Claude was still lost in thought when he felt a hand rest on his shoulder. He looked up and saw Ethan standing behind him. "What are you doing, man?" Ethan asked, pulling a chair closer and sitting beside Claude's desk. "Just working on a few things," Claude replied quietly. "Come on, look around," Ethan said. Claude glanced across the room. Men stood in small groups, talking and laughing. Nearly everyone wore a smile, their voices full of pride and excitement. "Today's a celebration," Ethan said. "And look at you, you're still working." With a light chuckle, he reached forward and gently closed the ledger in front of Claude. "I was just finishing it," Claude said, but Ethan did not let him return to his work. He held Claude's arm lightly and shook his head. "Let's go and have a cup of tea." Claude knew it was useless to argue, so he agreed. They walked to the small cafe nearby, where Claude noticed more salesmen gathered together, laughing and talking loudly about the current advertisement. Ethan and Claude took their teas and sat near the window. Claude glanced outside. The streets of Grand Rapids were covered in snow. A few children were playing in it, throwing snow at one another and laughing without care. Claude watched them for a moment and smiled softly. They talked quietly as they finished their teas. Ethan was the only person at work who truly liked Claude. Most of the others kept their distance. Maybe it was because Claude wasn't very talkative, or maybe because he was too honest. He always said what he believed was best for the company, and that often made others uncomfortable. He didn't have many friends, even outside the office. Ethan was the only one who seemed to understand him, apart from his parents. After they finished their teas, they were called to join a meeting by their boss. Mr. Halden had arranged the meeting to discuss the current advertisement, and both Claude and Ethan went along. When they entered the meeting room, several workers were already there. A few of the salesmen glanced at Claude, then turned to one another and laughed quietly, as if they were making fun of him. Claude took a seat beside Ethan. The room was not very large, but it was enough to hold 10 or 15 people. Mr. Halden had not arrived yet. Claude remained silent, looking around the room. The voices around him were loud, with people talking over one another. Most of them were still discussing the advertisement, praising it with excitement. A few minutes later, Mr. Halden entered the room with a proud smile on his face. He looked pleased, almost satisfied. Claude felt a flicker of confusion. He could not understand how Mr. Halden could be so happy when the company had gained no real advantage from the ad. Still, Claude felt hopeful about the meeting. This was his chance to speak, to share what the numbers showed. He only wished that the others would listen and try to understand. I'm sure you all know that we have created the best advertisements so far, Mr. Halden said, his voice filled with pride. No other company has done anything like this before. Today is a day for celebration. The room broke into loud applause. Several salesmen leaned forward to congratulate Mr. Halden, praising him for making the company more visible and respected through the advertisement. Claude stayed quiet as he listened to the voices around him. One salesman after another shared their opinions, claiming that Bissell had become the most well-known company in Grand Rapids and that it would soon be famous across the entire country. "Everyone knows the Bissell Carpet Sweeper," one of the salesmen said loudly. Mr. Halden smiled, pleased and confident, as the words filled the room. Claude tried to gather the courage to speak. He felt the weight of the ledger still in his mind, the numbers clear and honest. While everyone else joined the discussion with excitement, Claude struggled to find the strength to raise his voice. Ethan noticed his silence and the tension on his face. "Claude," he asked quietly, leaning closer, "is something wrong?" Claude looked at Ethan and knew he could speak to him first, before saying anything to Mr. Halden. Ethan was the only person at work who might understand him. "Ethan," Claude said quietly, leaning closer, "don't you think they are being proud for no real reason? I've already checked the numbers. Bissell spent a lot of money on these advertisements, but the sales did not increase enough because of them." Ethan's eyes widened. He quickly raised his hand and shooshed Claude. "Shh," he whispered. "Don't say that here." He glanced around the room to make sure no one was listening, then looked back at Claude. "Don't say these things in front of Mr. Halden. He'll get angry with you." Claude felt his chest tighten. He had hoped Ethan would understand him, maybe even support him. But instead, Ethan looked scared. Claude realized that Ethan didn't want trouble and wouldn't stand beside him. Claude looked down at his hands, feeling alone. The numbers were clear to him, but no one wanted to hear them, and for the first time, he understood that if he spoke up, he would have to do it by himself. The salesman kept talking in loud voices, praising the advertisement again and again. Claude felt nervous as he listened to them, but inside his heart, he knew the truth. He wanted to speak honestly about the numbers. Even if Mr. Halden might not like it, the facts were clear to him, and no excitement or praise could change them. Claude took a deep breath. Ethan was trying to stop him with worried looks, but Claude knew he could not stay silent anymore. He remembered his mother's words she had told him many times while growing up, that honesty mattered more than comfort, even if it meant standing alone. "Can I say something?" Claude finally spoke. But the room was too loud. People were still talking and laughing, and no one seemed to hear him. Claude looked at Ethan again. Ethan's face showed fear, almost like a warning. His eyes clearly said that Claude was putting his job at risk by speaking against everyone else. Claude swallowed hard. Knowing what he was about to do could change everything. Claude knew his observation was true. He was not against Bissell at all. In fact, he wanted the company to succeed in a real way, not just become famous for a short time. To him, true success meant earning more than what was spent, not just receiving praise. "I have something to say," he spoke again, this time louder. The room slowly went quiet. Everyone turned to look at Claude. He was usually the silent one in meetings, the man who listened while others talked. Seeing him speak up shocked them all. A few people exchanged looks, surprised and confused. "What do you want to say?" Mr. Halden finally asked. Claude felt a small sense of relief. At least he had been given a chance to speak. He knew he had to use this moment wisely and explain what he had seen in the numbers. "I know everyone is very happy about the current advertisement," Claude began, "but I've gone through the numbers carefully, and I don't believe this is something we should be proud of." The mood in the room changed instantly. People stared at him, some with anger in their eyes. Mr. Holden's face grew tense, clearly unhappy that Claude was questioning the success of the ad. Soon, voices filled the room again. Some people asked what he meant by such an observation. Others shouted, calling his words foolish. A few even mocked him, asking if he was blind and couldn't see how big and impressive the advertisement was. Claude stood there, his heart racing, knowing he had crossed a line, but also knowing he had spoken the truth. Claude looked at Mr. Holden, who was staring at him with clear anger in his eyes. Claude could tell that Mr. Holden did not like what he had said. Still, he knew he was not lying. He was only speaking the truth, even if no one wanted to hear it. "Do you even know what you're talking about?" Mr. Holden said sharply. "Have you even seen the advertisement? It's one of the best we've ever made. Are you blind?" The room fell silent. Claude felt his heart beat faster, but he did not look away. He took a deep breath. He knew this moment mattered. If he stayed quiet now, nothing would ever change. "Maybe you're right," Claude said calmly. "It is one of the best-looking ads we've made so far, but we also need to look at the numbers." A few people shifted in their seats. "I don't see any real advantage from this ad," Claude continued. The room filled with uneasy silence. Some people exchanged looks with one another. No one spoke, but it was clear they were uncomfortable. They didn't want to admit that Claude might be right, even if deep down they knew he was. "Mr. Hopkins, you should remember that you are just a bookkeeper," Mr. Holden said angrily. "Know your place." With that, he stood up from his chair and walked out of the meeting room without looking back. As soon as Mr. Holden left, the room filled with loud voices. Some people started talking at once, while others laughed openly. A few of the salesmen glanced at Claude and shook their heads, clearly enjoying the moment. Claude felt the disrespect burn inside him, but he stayed quiet. "Claude, you really need to think before you speak about such matters again," Henry said, one of the salesmen, as he passed by. "I think Claude has completely lost his mind," Walter added. The two of them laughed together and walked out of the room. Soon, everyone left. The room slowly became quiet again, everyone except Ethan. Claude remained seated, staring at the table in front of him. He didn't say a word. His hands rested on the edge of the desk, and his thoughts felt heavier than ever. "Hey," Ethan said softly as he placed a hand on Claude's shoulder. Claude looked up at him and forced a small smile. His chest felt tight, and for a moment he thought he might cry, but he didn't let it show. He kept the smile there, even though it didn't feel real. "I told you to stay silent," Ethan said quietly. "I know," Claude replied, "but I thought I should be honest and tell them the truth." "They don't really care," Ethan said gently. "All they care about is hearing that their advertisement is the best. They don't want to listen to anything against it." Claude lowered his eyes. He knew Ethan was right, even if it hurt to accept it. After a while, Ethan left the office. Claude stayed behind, sitting at his desk to finish the work he still had to do. The office slowly grew quiet as everyone else went home. When Claude was finally done, he closed his ledger, put on his coat, and left the building. His house was only a short walk from the Bissell office, so he decided to walk. Night had already fallen, and the streets were covered in snow. Each step crunched beneath his boots as he walked home, alone with his thoughts. After a few minutes of walking, Claude reached his house. He knocked on the door and soon heard a familiar voice. "Coming!" his mother called from inside. The wooden door opened, and an elderly woman stood there. There was a gentle smile on her face. She always welcomed her son with a smile, no matter how tired or worried she felt herself. Claude smiled back and stepped inside. His mother closed the door behind him and followed him into the room. "How was your day?" she asked softly. "Good," Claude replied, as he walked to a chair and sat down. She looked at him closely. "If it was a good day, why don't you look happy? You know you can't lie to your mother." Claude lowered his eyes. He knew she was right. He could never hide the truth from her. Slowly, he told her everything about the new advertisement, the excitement at the office, and the numbers that did not make sense to him. After he finished speaking, his mother went to the kitchen and returned with a glass of water. Claude took it from her and drank a few sips, feeling a little calmer than before. "I am proud of you," she said gently. "It doesn't matter if others don't agree with you. I am proud that you stayed honest and did your work with sincerity." Claude looked down. "But Mom, my boss didn't believe me. Instead of listening, he told me that I should know my place." She sat beside him and placed her hand over his. Her voice was calm and steady, like always. "You shouldn't let his words hurt you so much," she said. "People often reject the truth when it makes them uncomfortable, but you see what others don't, Claude. You're the man who knows the numbers. That's a gift, even if it feels like a burden now." Claude looked down. Her words were soft, but they landed with weight. A small fire began to build inside him, not anger, but resolve. After she left the room, Claude sat alone for a while. The fire had gone out in the small stove, and the house was quiet. He opened his leather notebook and turned to a blank page. The edges were worn from use, but most of the pages were still empty. For years, it had only held numbers. Tonight, he picked up his pencil and wrote something different. Why does no one ask if the ads work? What does a customer need to see before they believe? What is the real cost of being wrong? He looked at the questions for a long time. Then he closed the notebook gently and set it down beside the lamp. Outside, snow continued to fall. Claude didn't know it yet, but he had already begun to leave the ledger behind. And so ends our first chapter in the life of Claude C. Hopkins, a quiet man in a noisy world. Tonight, he asked the question no one else dared to speak aloud. What is the real cost of being wrong? They say revolutions begin with shouting, but sometimes they begin with a man, a ledger, and a single question written in the dark. If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe The Persuaders, Season 1, Episode 2, Don't Guess Test. He looked at the drawing again, then back at him. "And Mr. Holden knows about this." Claude hesitated. "Not yet." Emily was silent for a moment. "If he finds out we're doing this without permission, we could both get in trouble," she said. "I know," Claude replied. "I won't pretend otherwise, but I believe this could work." She tapped the paper lightly with her finger. "You're asking me to stay late, to use materials, to take a risk." Claude nodded. "Yes." Emily didn't answer right away. She was still considering it when Claude looked down at the sketch in his hands. His fingers felt tight around the paper. His heart was beating faster than usual. This moment felt important, and just yesterday, he wouldn't have had the courage to try this at all. Back then, Emily was just another face in the workshop. He didn't even know her last name. His thoughts were quieter, more cautious, neatly penned into a leather notebook that rarely left his side. It had begun that morning. Claude was alone in the Bissell office, as usual. The city outside was wrapped in snowfall, the windows laced with frost. Wrapped in his long black coat, he flipped through his ledger by the gray light creeping in through the blinds. It was silent, peaceful, the kind of silence that usually calmed him. But not that day. That day, something had shifted. A question had taken root in his mind, subtle at first, but too heavy to ignore. He reached for his notebook, the one worn at the corners from years of quiet thinking, and wrote slowly. What if the problem isn't the product, but the people who sell it? He stared at the words for a long moment. The office was still quiet, but his mind wasn't. Thoughts kept running through his head. Maybe the carpet sweeper wasn't the real issue. Maybe the problem was how it was being sold, or who was trying to sell it. He wondered why sales were not improving, and what could be done to change that. He didn't have answers yet, only questions, but writing them down made him feel a little lighter. The day turned out to be long and exhausting. By the time work ended, Claude felt completely drained. When he reached home, he lay down on his bed almost immediately. His body was tired, but his mind was still busy, holding on to the question he had written that morning. It was the next morning. Claude slowly opened his eyes and felt the brightness filling his small room. For a moment, he sat quietly on the bed, lost in thought. His mind went back to the previous day, to the meeting, and to the words his boss had spoken, telling him to know his place. The memory still hurt, but Claude knew he couldn't let those words control him forever. He believed he was right, even if no one else agreed. He wasn't trying to cause trouble, he was only being honest. Everything he did was for the good of Bissell. Even if his ideas were not liked by his boss or the others, he knew deep inside that he was doing the right thing. That thought gave him a little strength. He reminded himself that honesty mattered more than approval, and that he needed to be confident in his work. After a while, Claude stood up, took a quick shower, and got ready for the day. He put on the same suit he usually wore. He didn't own many clothes and wasn't a wealthy man, but he was content with what he had. Simple living suited him, and he cared more about his work than appearances. As he walked into the small living room, he saw the familiar wooden table with 3 chairs, which also served as their dining table. His father was already sitting there, having his breakfast while reading a newspaper. "Good morning, son," his mother said warmly as she watched Claude come closer to the table. "Good morning," Claude replied softly and took his seat. His father was sipping his coffee while reading the morning newspaper, fully focused on the news. Claude quietly began eating his breakfast. He didn't have much time. He needed to get to the office on time. Claude was a very disciplined man. He always got to work early, and most days, he was the first person to enter the office. He truly cared about his work. While most workers at Bissell worked 8 to 10 hours a day, Claude often worked up to 12 hours. Sometimes, he even brought his ledger home and continued working late into the night. He didn't work just to fill pages with numbers. He worked because he wanted the company to grow, to increase sales, and to achieve real success. For Claude, honesty and dedication mattered more than comfort or praise. After a few minutes, his father finished reading the newspaper and placed it on the table. He took a few slow sips of his coffee, then looked at Claude thoughtfully. "I just saw Bissell's new ad in today's paper," he said. "You didn't mention it yesterday." Claude stopped eating and looked up. He wasn't excited to talk about the ad. In his heart, he didn't see it as a success. To him, it felt like a mistake. "I forgot," he replied quietly. His father didn't push the matter. He could tell Claude didn't want to talk about it. After a short pause, his father spoke again. "Your mother told me what Mr. Holden said to you." Claude glanced at his mother. She gave him a small, apologetic smile. So she had told him. He didn't blame her, not really, but something tightened in his chest anyway. The same feeling he'd carried since the meeting, like the whole world was watching, waiting to see if he'd gone too far. He looked back at his plate and spoke softly. "It was just a bad day, that's all." He didn't look up, but he felt his father's eyes on him. "You know," his father said, voice calm but firm, "we're proud of you." Claude looked up, surprised. "I respect the fact that you stayed honest," his father continued, "even when no one wanted to hear it." Something in Claude's chest eased. He hadn't been sure if his father would understand, but he did. A small smile appeared on Claude's face. Those words meant more to him than his father knew. "Thank you," Claude said. He picked up his office bag, nodded to his parents, and stepped out of the house, heading to the Bissell office. As Claude walked toward the office, he suddenly heard someone calling his name. "Mr. Hopkins, can you wait for me?" He stopped and turned around. Emily Watson was hurrying toward him, her steps quick but unsteady. She looked tired and slightly out of breath. Claude waited patiently until she reached him. "Good morning," he said kindly. Emily paused for a moment, resting her hands on her coat as she caught her breath. "Good morning," she said, her voice still a little uneven. Claude gave a small nod. "Good morning." They stood together for a second in the cold morning air. Emily worked in the carpentry department. She helped build the carpet sweepers, sanding, shaping, assembling the wooden parts with quiet skill. Claude had seen her work once or twice in passing. She wasn't loud or flashy, but she was good, the kind of person who didn't waste time on things that didn't matter. Claude wasn't sure what to say. Not many people chose to walk with him, but he was glad she had. "All right," he said simply, and they fell into step together. "I saw you ahead and thought I'd walk with you to the office," she said with a small smile. Claude nodded, and they began walking to work together. As they walked, they talked about their work and the small challenges they faced each day. The cold morning air surrounded them, and the sound of their footsteps mixed with the quiet streets. When they reached the Bissell building, they exchanged a brief nod and went in different directions, each heading toward their own duties for the day. Claude was checking the previous orders from the dealers when he noticed something strange. There were only a few repeat orders for the carpet sweepers. Most of the dealers who had ordered once did not place another order again. This confused Claude. If the product was good, why were they not buying more? He leaned back in his chair and thought about it for a moment. Maybe the problem was not the product itself. Maybe something else was stopping the dealers from ordering again. The question stayed in his mind, but he did not yet have a clear answer. Later that day, a sales meeting was held at Bissell, and Claude attended. Ethan was not there. Mr. Halden had sent him to handle deliveries on the other side of the building. The room was filled with sales representatives giving their opinions. Most of them complained about the same thing. They said the shopkeepers were lazy and careless, and that was why the carpet sweepers were not selling well. Their voices grew louder as they spoke, each one blaming the dealers for poor sales. Claude stayed silent. He listened carefully. He did not want to speak without being sure. Deep inside, he felt that the dealers were not the real problem, even though everyone else believed they were. The shopkeepers were trying to sell the sweepers, but maybe they did not know how to explain the product to customers. Maybe they needed help instead of blame. The thought stayed with him, and once again, he kept it to himself. He knew something important before speaking. He needed proof. After the meeting ended, Claude returned to his desk and noticed Ethan already waiting for him. The moment Ethan saw Claude, he could tell something was on his mind. Claude's thoughtful expression gave it away. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked immediately as Claude sat down, concern in his voice. Claude didn't open his ledger right away. Instead, he looked at Ethan and spoke quietly. "That meeting," he said. "They're all blaming the dealers." Ethan frowned. "That doesn't surprise me." "But I don't think they're right," Claude continued. "The shopkeepers are trying. They just don't know how to explain the product. They don't have enough information. They're being blamed for a problem that isn't theirs." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked uneasy. "You know what happened last time you spoke against them," he said carefully. "Halden doesn't like being challenged." "I know," Claude said. "That's why I'm not saying anything yet." Ethan studied him. "Then what are you going to do?" Claude hesitated. "I've been thinking maybe I should see the shops for myself. Just observe, not argue, just understand." Ethan leaned back, torn. "That sounds risky," he admitted. "If Halden finds out." "He probably won't," Claude said. "And if he does, I won't involve you." There was a long pause. Finally, Ethan sighed. "You're going to do this no matter what I say, aren't you?" Claude didn't answer. He didn't need to. Ethan shook his head slightly, then gave a small, reluctant smile. "All right," he said. "If you're going to do it, then do it properly. Go see the shops. Just be careful." Claude felt something ease in his chest. Not excitement, not relief, just quiet clarity. "I will," he said. Claude left the office and set out to visit several hardware stores, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. Ethan had promised to handle everything at the office while Claude was away, but he couldn't shake the small fear that his boss might somehow find out about this risky plan. Still, he knew he had to see the situation for himself. At the first few shops he visited, Claude immediately noticed a problem. He couldn't even find the Bissell Carpet Sweepers at first. They weren't displayed in front where customers could see them. They were tucked away behind stacks of other goods, almost hidden from view. Dust had begun to settle on the machines, making them look even less appealing. "Why do you keep them behind the shelves like this? How will customers even notice them?" Claude asked one of the shopkeepers, trying to keep his tone calm but firm. The shopkeeper shrugged and glanced at the dusty sweeper. "I didn't know where to put it," he admitted. "Nobody seems interested in buying it anyway, so I just kept it back here." Claude stayed silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then, he pulled out his small leather-bound notebook and carefully wrote down what he had observed. He knew that problems like this needed to be solved if Bissell Carpet Sweepers were ever going to sell better. Seeing the issue firsthand sparked an idea in his mind, and he felt a small surge of determination. How many carpet sweepers have you sold, and what feedback have you received from the buyers? Claude asked. I've only sold 2 so far, the shopkeeper replied. Both of them keep coming back, saying they don't know how to use the machines. I don't really know either, so I can't explain it properly. Claude nodded slowly, understanding the problem. He took out his small leather-bound notebook again and carefully wrote down this problem. He knew these were serious obstacles that needed to be solved if sales were going to improve. Satisfied for the moment, he went back to work. Ethan had taken care of everything at the office, so no one knew that Claude had gone out to investigate, and Mr. Halden had no idea what Claude was planning to do. Claude sat quietly, thinking deeply about how to solve these problems. After a while, ideas started forming in his mind. As most of the workers began leaving for the day, Claude stayed behind. He decided to meet Emily, knowing she was the one who could help him bring his plan to life. He walked to the area where Emily was working on some carpet sweeper machines. 2 other men were busy around her, and Claude felt nervous, unsure of how to approach her without attracting attention. Soon, Emily noticed him and walked over. "Hey, Claude, what are you doing here?" she asked, a hint of confusion in her voice. "I need your help," Claude said. Emily looked puzzled, unsure what he meant. Soon, the 2 other workers finished what they were doing and left for the day. Claude felt a wave of relief. Now he could finally explain everything to her. He carefully showed her a page from his notebook. On it was a simple design for a display rack that would hold the carpet sweepers in the shops, making them easy for customers to see instead of hidden behind shelves. Emily studied the page quietly. "This is your idea?" she asked. "Yes," Claude said. "I think it could help sales." She looked at the drawing again, then back at him. "And Mr. Halden knows about this?" Claude hesitated. "Not yet." Emily was silent for a moment. "If he finds out we're doing this without permission, we could both get in trouble," she said. "I know," Claude replied. "I won't pretend otherwise, but I believe this could work." She tapped the paper lightly with her finger. "You're asking me to stay late, to use materials, to take a risk." Claude nodded. "Yes." Emily didn't answer right away. Then she said quietly, "I've seen the sweepers we make. They're good machines. They deserve to be shown properly." Claude looked at her, surprised. She folded the page carefully and handed it back. "All right," she said. "I'll help you, but only because I want to see if this idea really works." Claude let out a slow breath. "Thank you." "I can make 5, she added, "but you'll have to give me time. This isn't magic." "That's fair," Claude said. Claude returned to his desk and began thinking about the second problem. After some time, he found a solution. He decided to create a sales circular flyer for the shopkeepers. The flyer would explain the product clearly, helping the dealers understand how the carpet sweeper worked so they could guide their customers better and sell more units. The next day, Claude took the flyers and the display racks and delivered them to 5 shopkeepers who already stocked the carpet sweepers. He wanted to see if these 2 changes would actually help increase sales. That night, after returning home, he opened his leather-bound notebook and wrote a single question. If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders Episode 3, The Flower on the Rug. That night, long after the city had gone quiet, Claude sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open in front of him. The question still lingered in his mind. How do you make someone believe what they can't see? He rested the pencil in his hand, but didn't write. Then, a sudden sound behind him. A sharp crack, followed by silence. He turned. His mother stood near the counter, frozen. A broken bowl lay at her feet. Flour spread slowly across the dark rug. For a moment, Claude didn't move. He had seen this before. Or rather, he had felt this moment coming without knowing when. "Oh no," his mother whispered. "That was supposed to be for bread tomorrow." Claude stood. "Wait," he said quietly. He walked to the corner of the room and picked up the carpet sweeper. His mother watched him, confused. Claude pushed it forward in one smooth motion. The flower disappeared. He stopped. Slowly, he opened the container. Inside was the proof. White, clear, undeniable. Not a claim, not a promise. Proof. Claude stared at it, and in that moment the answer became clear. He would not convince people with words. He would show them. It was a dark, quiet night. Claude sat near the window, watching the snow fall softly outside. The streets looked empty, covered in white, and everything felt still. It had been a few days since he had given the flyers and display racks to the shopkeepers, and now all he could do was wait. He hoped, more than anything, that his efforts would lead to something better. Then, the day before, Mr. Holden had called him into his office. Claude's heart had dropped the moment he heard his name. For a brief second, he was sure his secret work had been discovered. The flyers, the display racks, the fact that he had handed them out without permission. He imagined his boss getting angry, questioning his decisions, maybe even punishing him for stepping beyond his role. But that wasn't the case. Mr. Holden still didn't know about the shop visits. However, he had come across the display rack design Claude had created to make things easier for Emily to assemble. Instead of appreciating the idea, Mr. Holden had scolded him. He reminded Claude that he was only a bookkeeper, not a designer, and that his job was to focus on numbers, not ideas outside his position. The words stayed with Claude even after he left the office. Now, sitting by the window, those thoughts returned. Still, deep down, he believed he had done the right thing. After a while, he moved away from the window and went to bed. Tomorrow, he would check the sales numbers again and compare them with the previous weeks. As he closed his eyes, one question stayed in his mind. Had his efforts made any difference at all? Over the next few days, Claude began receiving letters from the dealers. They thanked him for his support and guidance, explaining that their sales had improved noticeably. Now that they understood the product properly, they could explain its use to customers with confidence. The flyers also made a difference, helping customers understand the carpet sweepers before making a purchase. Encouraged, Claude opened his ledger one evening and carefully went through the numbers. His heart felt lighter as he noticed the steady increase in orders. For the first time, he could clearly see that his efforts were paying off. He wasn't just keeping records anymore, he was helping the company grow. Before long, the salesman also found out about the flyers and learned that Claude was the one behind them. A few of them approached him, curious and slightly surprised. They asked questions, and Claude shared his ideas willingly, explaining how the materials could help both dealers and customers. Word spread quickly. Soon, the entire Bissell office was buzzing. Everyone was confused, but impressed. Orders were increasing at a rate they hadn't seen before, especially when the formal advertisements had failed to deliver the same results. No one fully understood how or why it was happening, but Claude did. One day, another staff meeting was held. As everyone settled into their seats, Mr. Holden spoke briefly about the recent changes in sales. He muttered something about whoever sent that display rack out. Without mentioning Claude's name, the words sounded more like an obligation than real praise, vague, half-hearted. As if he didn't want to admit the idea had worked. Everyone in the room understood that the company was benefiting, yet no one openly acknowledged the person behind it. Claude stayed quiet, listening without reacting. From across the room, Ethan glanced at him and gave a small, knowing smile. It was enough. Claude smiled back, knowing that at least one person truly understood what he had achieved. That silent exchange meant more to him than any hollow recognition. Later that night, Claude sat near his bedroom window. The sky was calm, the silence settling around him like a blanket. He stared out for a few moments, letting his thoughts slow. Then, reaching for his leather-bound notebook, he opened it carefully and began to write. Help the dealer sell, and you sell more. He paused, then added a second line beneath it. Next, how do we prove it works? To anyone, anywhere? Claude read the words again, letting them settle in his mind. Then, slowly, he closed the notebook, placed it beside him, and returned to watching the quiet sky, already thinking about what his next step should be. The following week, Claude sat quietly at his desk in the Bissell office. The old wooden table creaked slightly beneath the weight of his open ledger. He went through the numbers once again, slowly and carefully, as he always did. Some figures made him pause. Yes, sales had increased in several places. There was no doubt about that. The flyers and display racks were helping. Some dealers were ordering more than they ever had before, but not all of them. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he noticed the same few names again and again. Certain dealers were still struggling. Their numbers had barely moved. The improvement was uneven, and that bothered him. If the idea worked, why didn't it work everywhere? Claude closed the ledger gently and reached for his notebook again. He opened it to a blank page, resting his pencil for a moment before writing, as if he needed to hear the question clearly in his own mind first. How do we prove it works? To anyone, anywhere. He paused, tapping the pencil against the page. Then he added another line. How do you make someone believe what they can't see? He read the questions once more, slowly. Then, closing the notebook again, he sat in silence, staring ahead, turning the problem over in his mind. The numbers had shown him something, but not everything, and until he understood what was missing, he knew his work wasn't finished. He visited a few more dealers that day, hoping to hear something different, but most of them shared the same problem. They thanked him for the flyers and admitted they helped, to a point. A few customers had taken them home and shown interest, but most still hesitated. The dealers explained that many customers listened politely, but didn't truly believe the claims. They were used to cleaning their carpets with brooms, despite the time and physical effort involved. To them, the carpet sweeper sounded too easy, too good to be true. No matter how much the dealers talked about it, customers preferred to stick with what they knew. As Claude moved from shop to shop, he began to notice a pattern. It wasn't that people disliked the carpet sweeper. They didn't trust it. They couldn't believe in something they had never seen work with their own eyes. Words weren't enough. Promises weren't enough. By the time he walked back to the office, the problem had formed clearly in his mind. The customers weren't refusing because the product was weak. They were refusing because belief required proof. Until they saw it for themselves, no explanation could convince them. Later that day, at a Bissell sales meeting, the same issue came up again. Many of the sales representatives blamed the customers. They claimed housewives were too old-fashioned, too resistant to change. They were comfortable with their brooms, they argued, and saw no reason to try something new. Claude listened quietly, but he didn't agree. To him, it wasn't about stubbornness. It was about doubt. That night, long after the city had gone quiet, Claude was still awake. The room was dim, and the silence around him felt heavy, his thoughts circling the same question. How could he make people believe? He paced slowly, thinking, when his eyes landed on the rug stretched across the floor of his room. Something clicked. An idea struck him. Without wasting a moment, he fetched the carpet sweeper, then went to the kitchen and returned with a small bowl of flour. His heart beat faster as he knelt down and carefully sprinkled the white flour across the rug. The contrast was sharp, clear, impossible to ignore. He picked up the sweeper and pushed it forward. In just a few seconds, barely 5, the rug was clean. The flour was gone. He opened the dust container. There it was, the proof. Claude stared at it. Then, without hesitation, he did it again and again. Each time, the result was the same. Finally, he opened his ledger and wrote down every step. The time, the movement, the result. At that moment, he knew. This time, he wouldn't try to convince anyone with words. He would simply show them, and once they saw it, truly saw it, they would believe. The next day, Claude visited a local shop where Bissell carpet sweepers were displayed. He stood quietly for a while, observing, then approached the shopkeeper. "Would you mind if I tried something?" he asked. "A small live demonstration?" The shopkeeper hesitated, uncertain. "Do you really think this will work?" he asked, eyeing him. Claude nodded. "I think it might." He took a small amount of flour and sprinkled it across a carpet laid near the counter. Just then, a housewife already browsing nearby noticed and stopped to watch. Claude politely asked if she'd stay a moment. Curious, she agreed. Without much explanation, he picked up the sweeper and ran it over the flour. Seconds later, the rug was clean. Not a trace of white remained. The housewife stared, wide-eyed. "How can it be this easy?" she murmured. Moments later, she left the shop and returned with a friend. Claude repeated the demonstration. Same flour, same method, same result. Both women watched closely, then exchanged glances, surprised, even a little suspicious. "They're doing some kind of flour trick," one whispered. But it wasn't a trick. It was proof. After that day, the shopkeeper began using live demonstrations regularly. Customers gathered to watch, just like those two women had. And once they saw the results with their own eyes, they trusted the product. Once they trusted it, they were ready to buy. Claude knew the idea was working. What he had seen in that one store was beginning to repeat itself. The results were no longer small or isolated. They were spreading. Quietly, he sent short memos to 3 other shops. In each note, he suggested trying the same demonstration method and observing the results. Along with the memo, he included a simple instruction card. It laid out each step: how to sprinkle the flour, how to sweep it, how to let customers watch without overselling. The message was clear: don't explain, show. The card also explained why the method worked better than words. Because belief came naturally once customers saw the proof themselves. Claude added a small letter code to each instruction card, tiny, almost invisible, but it allowed him to track where the repeat orders were coming from. It was his quiet way of testing what worked and what didn't. Over the next few days, Claude checked the numbers every morning. Sales were rising faster than before. The stores using the demonstration method were placing repeat orders more frequently. The difference was undeniable. Then came another sales meeting at Bissell. Claude attended as usual. As soon as the discussion turned to the rise in orders, he sensed it. A quiet discomfort in the room. Some of the salesmen were not pleased. "Is this really how we're increasing sales now?" Henry said, shaking his head. "By doing cheap little tricks in stores?" Walter laughed lightly and added, "What's next? Magic shows?" Claude stayed quiet. He had learned by now that arguing would not help him. The numbers were speaking on his behalf. Mr. Halden leaned back in his chair, clearly unsure of how to feel. "It's undignified," he said slowly. Then, after a pause, he added, "But sales are up." Claude understood then. They weren't ready to accept what he had done. They saw the results. They benefited from them. But praising him openly was still something they struggled with. Still, he didn't mind. What mattered was that the method worked. And the proof was already written in the ledger. In the days that followed, Claude began to notice something else. One of the younger salesmen had started talking about the live demonstrations. As if they had been his idea, he spoke confidently, describing the flour on the rug method to others, gaining attention, even respect. Some people believed him. Claude saw it. He noticed the shift. But he did not react. He didn't argue. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he quietly turned to his ledger and noted the pattern. What mattered wasn't who received the credit, but whether the idea was working. One afternoon, while Claude was sitting at his desk going through the numbers, a letter arrived. He opened it carefully. It was from one of the dealers he had helped earlier. The words were simple, but steady. A quiet thank you. The dealer spoke of how the demonstrations had changed everything. How customers now believed. How sales had climbed higher than ever before. Claude read the letter twice, then set it gently aside. It confirmed what he had hoped. The proof wasn't just in the method. It was in the change it created. Not long after, Mr. Halden made an announcement. He did not mention Claude's name. He didn't offer any praise, but he ordered the creation of a formal floor demonstration guide to be used by all sales representatives. Claude understood what it meant. His idea could no longer be ignored. It was helping the company. And even Mr. Halden had to accept that. No one openly thanked him, but Claude didn't need them to. A quiet satisfaction settled in his chest. His method had become part of Bissell's way of working. Even if no one said it out loud, he returned to his ledger, and wrote down the latest figures. That night, Claude sat near the small stove, letting the quiet warmth fill the room. Outside, everything was still. He rested the notebook on his lap, the worn leather familiar beneath his fingers. For a moment, he simply stared at the page, gathering his thoughts. Then he began to write. Don't argue, demonstrate. He paused, read the line again, and nodded slightly. Beneath it, he added, let the product do the talking. He leaned back, thinking, then wrote one last line, smaller, almost as if writing it only for himself. Do people buy what a product does, or how it makes them feel? Claude closed the notebook gently, and held it there for a moment. The room remained quiet, but inside him, something had changed. Claude had proven the sweeper worked, but he was beginning to suspect that proof alone wasn't always what people were buying. If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe The Persuaders Season 1, Episode 4. They laughed until the numbers came in. The room was already buzzing when Mr. Halden walked in. We've seen a sharp increase in orders over the past 2 weeks, he announced, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm, especially among the newer models. A murmur rippled across the salesmen. One of them leaned toward another and whispered behind his hand, a smirk, a stifled laugh. It's the polished wood versions. A salesman near the front added, customers keep asking for them. One store's already run out twice. Claude sat near the back of the room, silent, his notebook open, but untouched. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. We'll continue limited production and monitor demand, Mr. Halden said smoothly, as if the idea had drifted in on its own, unclaimed. No one mentioned where the idea had started. No one looked directly at Claude. But across the room, Ethan did. Just a small nod. I saw that, I know. Claude closed his notebook without writing a word. He had spoken weeks ago. They had laughed. Now the numbers were speaking for him. And still, the credit belonged to someone else. The meeting dissolved into talk of shipping schedules and margins, voices stacking over one another in confident agreement. Claude remained seated until the chairs began to scrape back and the room slowly emptied. He had imagined this moment differently once. Not the laughter, not the silence, not the way an idea could be reborn in someone else's mouth and suddenly sound respectable. As he rose from his chair, the noise of the room faded in his mind, replaced by something quieter. The memory of a small desk, a cup of cooling tea, and a question he had not yet known the answer to. It hadn't begun in this boardroom. It had begun in stillness. Claude sat at the small desk in his room, a cup of tea resting beside his papers. He lifted it, took a slow sip, then placed it back down. His eyes drifted across the room and settled on the carpet sweeper standing where he had left it after the flour test. It was clean, well-made, and perfectly functional. But as he looked at it more closely, something felt missing. It looked plain, dull, almost lifeless. He leaned back slightly in his chair, still staring at it, when a question formed in his mind. He reached for his leather notebook, opened it, and read what he had written there previously. Do people buy what a product does, or how it makes them feel? He paused and read it 3 times. He didn't try to answer it yet. He simply closed the notebook, finished his tea, and went to bed, the question staying with him as he drifted off to sleep. The next day, Claude visited one of the dealers he had been working with. They were discussing recent sales when a woman stepped into the shop. She wore a thick wool coat, her scarf tucked neatly at the collar, and carried herself with quiet purpose. She glanced around, then walked toward the counter. "Do you have one of those carpet sweepers?" she asked. The shopkeeper nodded and brought one out. It was a standard Bissell model, simple, well-built, and polished to a soft finish. He explained how it worked, just as Claude had taught him, how it picked up dirt with a single pass, how easy it was to empty. The woman examined it with interest, running her fingers gently along the handle. She knelt slightly to inspect the base, then stood upright again. "It seems to work well," she said slowly. "But," She paused. There's another one I saw last week. It had darker wood, looked more elegant. This one. She glanced at the sweeper again. This one feels too plain. Claude said nothing, but listened carefully. The woman thanked the shopkeeper and walked out without making a purchase. The shopkeeper sighed. That's the third one this week, he said. They all ask the same thing. If we have something that looks nicer. One of the other brands started using richer wood finishes. I've seen them. Glossy, even decorative. They don't clean as well, but people seem to like how they look. Claude nodded slowly, absorbing the words. He wasn't surprised by what he'd heard, but now he had confirmation. Claude didn't argue or defend the product. He simply nodded as he made a note in his notebook. As he walked through a small local parlor nearby, his eyes moved around the room. He noticed polished wooden chairs, smooth and well cared for. In one corner, there was a baby's cradle, carved with care and simple patterns. Nothing in the room was expensive, yet everything looked beautiful and meaningful. The place felt warm and dignified. At that moment, something became clear to Claude. People didn't just want things that worked. They wanted things that felt right in their homes. He knew now that he had to talk to Mr. Halden. If the carpet sweeper worked well and looked beautiful, it wouldn't just be a tool anymore. It would be something people would be proud to keep in their homes. His mind drifted back to evenings at home, his mother arranging simple things just so, as if the way something looked could change how it felt. She used to say it wasn't about cost, just care. He realized that for many women, beauty was part of their dignity, not just a luxury. The next day, when the meeting was held, Claude didn't stay silent. He had decided to share his idea. As discussions unfolded, he finally spoke up. The salesman looked at him with curious, skeptical expressions. Most didn't like him, but they had to listen. Claude explained that he believed the company should offer a more luxurious version of the carpet sweepers. He suggested creating sweepers made from premium woods, bird's eye maple, walnut, and vermilion, that combined both functionality and elegance. When he finished, some of the salesmen burst into laughter. They found the idea amusing. "Are you serious?" one of them asked, chuckling. Claude didn't react. He knew he was right, so he let them laugh. "And then what's next? Do you want us to make gold-plated handles too?" Henry asked, laughing. Henry was the type who enjoyed mocking others' ideas, and Claude had been his favorite target. Yet Claude remained calm and silent. "It's a cleaning tool, not a Christmas ornament," finally said Mr. Halden, dismissing the idea. Claude tried to convince him that women appreciated tools that not only worked well, but also looked beautiful. But Mr. Halden refused to agree, leaving Claude to wonder if anyone would ever see the value in his vision. Claude knew they weren't going to believe in him, so he realized he had to take matters into his own hands. He decided to meet Emily, someone he trusted and knew would support him. He shared his idea of creating a better, fancier carpet sweeper with her. After listening carefully to his vision, Emily exclaimed, "Why didn't Halden agree to this? I think it's a fantastic idea." Claude nodded. "Yeah, but he's just not ready to listen. That's why I've decided to make a new, fancy prototype myself and see if it actually sells." "Okay, I'll help make it," she said. Claude smiled warmly. This was the second time Emily had supported him, and he felt grateful for a friend who was willing to help, even if it meant risking her job. "Thank you so much, Emily," he said sincerely, and she smiled in return. With the help of two of her friends, Emily worked tirelessly over the next few days to create the prototype, a polished wood carpet sweeper that looked elegant and refined. Once it was ready, Claude handed it to one of the dealers. Almost immediately, it sold out. Claude realized that women appreciated carpet sweepers that not only worked well, but also looked beautiful, as they wanted them to complement the look of their homes. Later that same day, a woman came into the store looking for a carpet sweeper to give as a wedding gift. She asked specifically about the polished wood model, said she'd seen it before, and thought it would be perfect. But there was only one prototype, and it had already been sold. Soon, the dealers began requesting more of these new, elegant carpet sweepers from Bissell. Reluctantly, Mr. Halden agreed to produce a limited batch. He wasn't convinced they would sell. He was taking a risk, not because of Claude's insistence, but because the dealers were demanding it. Meanwhile, Claude began tracking orders for the fancy wood sweepers using discrete notes. A small dot on the reorder slip helped him monitor their popularity. As the holiday season approached, sales began to rise steadily. Customers were choosing the carpet sweepers with polished wood finishes over the dull, standard gray models. Claude watched closely as the elegant sweepers consistently outperformed the ordinary ones, confirming that people valued both beauty and functionality in the tools they brought into their homes. One afternoon, Claude was absorbed in his work at his desk when Ethan walked in and pulled up a chair to sit across from him. "You look worried," Claude said, glancing up from his papers. "Yeah," Ethan admitted, his expression earnest. "I've been thinking about you, and I'm worried." "Worried? About what?" Claude asked, curious. "You're overworking yourself, doing so much for this company, and they're taking all the credit without giving you any," Ethan said. Claude listened quietly, knowing deep down that Ethan was right, but he wasn't doing it for recognition. "It's okay," Claude replied gently, a small smile forming on his lips. "You don't need to worry about me. I'm happy seeing the numbers go up." His smile was calm and content, and it made Ethan smile in return. "I can't believe it." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "You're putting in all this work, not getting any credit, and you don't even care." Claude laughed softly. "That's okay. Come on, let's take a break and have a cup of tea." Ethan grinned, relieved, and together they left the office, stepping out for a well-deserved cup of tea. That weekend, Claude was walking through his neighborhood when he paused in front of a modest family home. Through the window, he could see a small gathering inside. His attention was caught by a young boy, beaming with pride as he carried a neatly wrapped wooden box, clearly a gift for his mother. The boy handed the box to his mother, who carefully opened it. Inside was a Bissell Carpet Sweeper with a premium wood finish. The moment her eyes landed on it, her face lit up with delight. She hugged her son tightly, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead, clearly touched by both the thoughtfulness of the gift and the elegance of the sweeper itself. She placed the sweeper carefully beside the fireplace, positioning it almost like a cherished piece of furniture rather than just a cleaning tool. Claude stood there, a soft smile spreading across his face as he watched the scene. He realized then that the premium wood finish sweeper was far more than a mere household tool. For the women who used it, it represented beauty, care, and a sense of pride in their homes. A few days later, another meeting was held at Bissell. The room was fuller than usual, every salesman in attendance, along with most of the staff from other departments. Claude took a seat near the back and opened his notebook, though he didn't write anything down. Mr. Holden entered a few minutes late, but unlike his usual hurried pace, he walked in slowly, with a noticeable ease in his step. He looked around the room with something close to satisfaction. "We've seen a sharp increase in orders over the past 2 weeks," Mr. Holden said, adjusting his cufflinks as he spoke. The metal caught the light briefly before settling back into shadow, especially among the newer models. Before he had entered, the room had been restless, chairs scraping against the wooden floor, papers shuffling, the low murmur of men who believed themselves practical. The faint smell of ink and fresh ledger paper lingered in the air, mingling with wool coats damp from the cold outside. Now, there was a pause, not long, just long enough. The kind of silence that gathers before a verdict. No one needed to ask which models he meant. A quiet stir moved through the salesmen. A few glanced toward Claude, not directly, not boldly, but just enough to register awareness. Some expressions were neutral, others carried something sharper. One man leaned toward another and whispered behind his hand. The other smirked, but kept his eyes forward. A salesman near the front cleared his throat and raised his hand. "It's the polished wood versions," he said. "Customers keep asking for them. One store's already run out twice." Another faint rustle, more papers shifting. Someone's chair creaked. Mr. Holden nodded slowly, his expression composed, almost thoughtful. "It seems there's interest in quality," he replied, as though the conclusion had arrived gently on its own. "We'll continue with the limited production and monitor demand." The silence broke. Voices overlapped. Packaging, pricing, shipping schedules. confident talk, practical talk, the language of men who believed they were steering the ship, none of it directed toward Claude. He sat still, the scent of ink sharp in his senses, his notebook open before him. The page remained blank. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. He had spoken weeks ago, and laughter had filled this same air. Now the same words returned, polished, respectable, detached from their origin, as if they had always belonged to the room. Claude closed his notebook slowly. The soft thud of leather against paper was nearly swallowed by the hum of discussion. He didn't feel anger, only certainty. Across the room, Ethan caught his eye and gave him a small nod. Nothing dramatic, just enough to say, "I saw that, I know." Claude returned it, barely perceptible. He didn't need applause. The numbers were already doing the talking. After a few minutes, Mr. Holden spoke about the recent sales, and everyone listened attentively. "Holiday sales have doubled," he said, a small smile appearing on his face, probably proud of the results. "Maybe it's because of the gift idea," he added, and several heads around the table nodded in agreement. Claude knew the truth. The new polished wood sweepers were being purchased mostly as gifts. People saw them as perfect presents, especially working-class families, who treated the premium sweeper as a special, once-in-a-decade purchase. What had once been a simple utility item had transformed into a desirable object, not through trickery, but because it held emotional value for the buyers. After the meeting ended, Claude returned to his office and sat at his desk. His ledger lay open before him. He carefully drew a line under the gift sales column, marking the success of the polished wood sweepers, and then gently closed the ledger, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. After a few minutes, Claude finished his work for the day and headed home. As he walked, he noticed someone a few feet ahead. It was Emily, also making her way home. He felt a moment of surprise. Usually she left early, but tonight the sky was already dark. "Emily!" he called out. She stopped and turned around. The instant she saw him, a smile of relief spread across her face. Claude walked up to her. "Thank God it's you. I was scared," she admitted, a hint of worry still lingering in her voice. "Why are you out so late today?" he asked, concern in his tone. "I had a lot of work to finish before leaving," she explained. "I see," Claude nodded quietly. As they walked together toward their homes, their conversation flowed naturally. Emily congratulated him on the recent success of the sweepers, which she knew was largely due to his efforts, though he never sought full credit. "I really must thank you," Claude said sincerely. "If you hadn't helped me, I probably wouldn't have done anything. You were the one who helped me make the prototype of the fancy carpet sweeper." Emily smiled, her voice low but certain. "I always thought it would work. I just don't know why no one else could see it." She paused, then added, "You're not really just keeping the books anymore, Claude. Not with the way you've been thinking." Her words made him smile, a quiet warmth spreading through him as they continued walking home, side by side. When Claude reached his home, his mother was already waiting for him. She had brought his dinner, which he ate quickly, grateful for the warmth and care. Once he finished, he went to his room, ready to spend some quiet time alone. He sat at his desk, the familiar space where he often poured his thoughts into his notebook. There was something on his mind that he needed to put into words. He opened the notebook carefully, picked up his pen, and began to write. Beauty is not decoration. Sometimes it's the reason they choose. After writing, he paused, staring at the words for a few moments. His thoughts drifted, carried by the quiet of the evening. He glanced out of the window. Though the sky was dark, the moon shone brightly, its glow reflecting softly in his eyes. A question had formed in his mind, one he felt compelled to capture immediately. Without hesitation, he wrote it below the previous text. But what happens when beauty is only skin deep? He underlined the question twice, a subtle mark of the unease it stirred within him. Claude didn't yet know why this problem felt so pressing, only that he sensed it might become significant soon. He had learned that emotions could drive action, and the realization made him feel both awe and a little apprehension. After spending a long while lost in thought, He finally set his pen down and went to bed. Sleep, however, did not come easily. His mind lingered on the day's events, the notebook's words, and the questions they raised. Hours later, he drifted into a deep, though restless sleep. Claude turned a simple carpet sweeper into something people were proud to display, proving that beauty could sell just as powerfully as proof. But if emotion can elevate an honest product, what happens when someone uses it to sell something that isn't? Join us next time on The Persuaders. Episode 5, The Snake Oil Smiles, when Claude discovers that honesty alone may not be enough to win in a world full of charming liars. If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at learnenglish.with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders Season 1. Episode 5, The Snake Oil Smiles. It was a Monday morning in the winter of 1894. Some time had passed since the launch of the polished wood carpet sweeper, and its quiet success had lifted sales across the board. The numbers were better, the dealers more assured. Still, Claude couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't enough. He knew improvement never stopped on its own. If sales had risen once, they could rise again, but only if he stayed ahead of the moment. A plan had already begun forming in his mind, though he hadn't fully shaped it yet. Claude woke earlier than usual that morning. After taking a quick shower, he sat down at his desk. Outside the window, the sky was still dark, heavy with the last stretch of night. It confirmed what he already knew. He had risen long before his usual hour, but that was nothing new when his thoughts refused to rest. He reached for his leather-bound notebook. Whenever doubt crept in, whenever a question wouldn't leave him alone, this was where it ended up. He opened it, paused for a second, and then wrote, "Is truth enough on its own?" He studied the words for a moment, as if waiting for them to answer back. They didn't. With a quiet breath, he closed the notebook and stood up. A little later, he joined his parents in the living room. They were already seated at the table, finishing their breakfast and speaking in low voices. His mother looked up when she noticed him. "Good morning, son," she said gently. "Good morning, Mom, Dad," Claude replied as he took a seat. His father offered a small smile, nothing more. They ate together in silence. No one felt the need to fill it. Claude didn't say anything but the question in his notebook. It stayed with him all the same. After finishing breakfast, Claude pushed his chair back and was about to stand when his father spoke. "We don't get to see you at home much anymore." Claude paused. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he cleared his throat. "I've been busy at work," he replied quietly, waiting for his father to say more. But his father didn't. He simply unfolded the newspaper and began reading, as if the thought had already passed. The silence felt heavier than any lecture. Claude glanced at his mother. She met his eyes and gave him a small, reassuring smile. Reaching out, she rested a hand gently on his shoulder. "We're proud of you," she said. "You're doing your duty honestly, and that matters." The tension in his chest loosened, just slightly. The words settled in the way only hers could, quiet but firm. No matter the doubt he faced at work, no matter who tried to silence him, his parents believed in him. That was enough. Later that morning, Claude stepped through the doors of the Bissell building. The air inside was still. His footsteps echoed faintly down the empty corridor as he made his way to his desk. Most of the others hadn't arrived yet. He liked it this way, before the noise, before the interruptions. This was when his mind was clearest. He set down his coat and sat, already focused. For days, the idea had been circling in his mind. A new advertisement, not louder, not flashier, but different. Something he believed could push the carpet sweepers even further. He began working, jotting down notes, crossing out lines, starting again. The office slowly came to life as footsteps and murmured voices filled the air. Henry arrived first, shuffling toward his desk a few feet away from Claude's. He let out a wide yawn, rubbing his eyes, clearly not fully awake yet. Claude didn't look up. His mind was already deep in the work ahead. "What are you doing, Claude?" Henry asked, leaning slightly toward his desk. Claude didn't answer right away. He already knew Henry wouldn't like what he was working on. If Henry sensed even a hint of a new advertisement, he would take it straight to Mr. Halden, and likely twist the story along the way. It wasn't the right time to explain anything. "I'm working on something," Claude said at last, keeping his eyes on the paper in front of him. Henry scoffed. "You're always working, man," he muttered, his tone sharp with irritation. Then he dropped into his chair, clearly annoyed. Claude kept writing, pretending not to notice. A while later, as he was adjusting a line on the draft, Ethan appeared beside his desk. "Aren't you planning to take a lunch break?" Ethan asked. Claude glanced at the clock and frowned. He hadn't realized how much time had passed. It was already past noon. He still had a few things to fix before he felt satisfied with the ad. "I'll come in 20 minutes, Claude said. "You should go ahead." Ethan crossed his arms. "No, I'm not going alone," he said firmly. "You're coming with me. Just stop working for a few minutes, at least." Claude sighed softly. He knew arguing was useless. His stomach also reminded him that skipping lunch wasn't a good idea. "All right," he said, standing up at last. They grabbed their coats and headed out together, walking toward a small restaurant nearby. Claude's mind was still half on the ad, but for now, he let the work wait. As they sat in the small restaurant eating their lunch, the conversation slowly turned to work. Both of them were tired, and it showed in the way they spoke, half relaxed, half weighed down by long days. Ethan looked up from his plate and studied Claude for a moment. "What are you working on?" he asked. "You've seemed unusually busy these days." Claude hesitated, then answered honestly, "I'm working on an advertisement. I think it might help increase the numbers." Ethan's face brightened. "That's a great idea," he said without hesitation. "You've already helped Bissell grow so much. Most of the recent sales are because of you. I still don't understand why they can't see that or appreciate it." Claude gave a small smile, but said nothing. He knew Ethan was right, yet appreciation wasn't what was driving him anymore. He wasn't working for praise or recognition. Right now, his mind was fixed on the work itself, on making something that actually worked. After they finished their lunch, they walked back to Bissell together. Claude returned to his desk and picked up where he had left off. The ad didn't come together in a single day. He kept refining it over the next few days, adjusting words, removing what felt unnecessary, and trying again. By the following week, the new advertisement finally went into circulation, and Claude didn't know what would come of it. He had no way of predicting the results. All he knew was that he had put his full effort into it, and for now, that had to be enough. After the advertisement had been running for a few days, Claude began checking the numbers regularly. Every morning, he went through the sales reports with quiet hope, but nothing had changed. A full week passed, and instead of improvement, the figures slowly began to fall. At first, he told himself it must be a mistake, perhaps a delay in reporting or a temporary dip. He checked the columns again and again, hoping he had read something wrong, but the truth became harder to ignore. The sales were not just flat, they were dropping. The next day, Claude decided to see the dealers himself. He wanted to hear directly from them instead of guessing. One by one, he asked what they thought about the new advertisement. One dealer sighed and said honestly, "Your ad is full of facts, but it feels empty. There's no feeling in it." The words unsettled Claude. He had believed facts were enough. He had carefully chosen every line, thinking clarity and honesty would do the work. Another dealer added, "It sounds cold, very clean, very technical. People read it, but they don't feel anything." Later, Claude overheard a buyer complain that the ad felt almost clinical, like it was written for a manual instead of real people. Claude left the dealers with his thoughts heavy. For the first time, he began to wonder if telling the truth, without anything else, was not enough to make people listen. It was another day, and the numbers were still falling. Claude sat at his desk, tension tight in his shoulders, staring at the sales reports. He couldn't understand it. He had written the ad carefully, filled it with facts, and yet it was failing. Confusion and frustration swirled in his mind, making it hard to focus. Ethan noticed Claude's unease and came over. "There's a local fair being held at the fairgrounds today," he said. "Maybe you should go. It'll help clear your mind." Claude shook his head without looking up. "I'm fine. I just need to keep checking the numbers." Ethan persisted. "Just for a little while. Step away for an hour. Sometimes seeing something else helps you think." Claude hesitated, but deep down, he knew Ethan was right. Reluctantly, he agreed. "All right, I'll go, but only for a short while." When he arrived at the fair, the noise and energy of the crowd hit him. He walked slowly from stall to stall, watching the vendors and the people browsing. Then something caught his attention, something that made him stop in his tracks. Slick pitchmen were selling ordinary, almost mundane items, but they did it with wide smiles and booming voices. Their promises were extravagant, their words rehearsed and confident. The products were simple, but they made them sound irresistible. Claude's brow furrowed. There were no facts, no proof, no real substance, only charm, exaggeration, and confidence. And yet, the people around the booths were listening. They were nodding, smiling, and buying without hesitation. He realized, almost with a jolt, that the pitchman's confidence was their real power. The truth alone, no matter how solid, would not capture anyone's attention. It wasn't lies that sold. It was the way those lies were presented with certainty and ease. Claude stood there quietly, watching, his mind turning over what he had seen. The truth, he now understood, was not always enough on its own. Claude couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way the pitchman lied so effortlessly, yet the customers still bought their products, kept bothering him. He stepped back, lost in thought, and his shoulder bumped into something solid. "Hey, watch out," a gentle voice said. Claude turned and saw a young woman sitting at a small desk. A chair was tucked neatly under it, papers scattered across the surface. She looked to be in her late 20s and wore a soft peach-colored dress that suited her well. Her hair was pulled back, but a few strands fell lightly across her forehead. She regarded him with a quiet curiosity, as if wondering where his mind had been before he collided with her booth. "Sorry, I didn't see your booth," Claude said, glancing at her with a small, apologetic smile. She nodded, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Yeah, I could tell. Your attention was somewhere else," she said, nodding toward the pitchmen in the distance. Claude turned his gaze, following hers. The pitchmen were still at work, smiling broadly, speaking confidently, and making promises he knew were false. They're so frustrating," Claude said, his voice low with irritation. "They're lying, and the customers believe them, and they're confident, so confident. That's what makes people trust them, even when it's all false." The woman listened quietly, studying him. She said nothing at first, her expression calm and attentive, letting him speak as he let his frustration spill out. Claude noticed the way her eyes followed his, as if she understood the anger, without needing him to explain everything. "By the way, my name is Claude Hopkins," he said, offering his hand. "I'm Elizabeth Belmont, but everyone calls me Liz," she replied, taking his hand firmly. Claude smiled as they let go. "It's nice to meet you, Liz." She nodded, a small, polite smile tugging at her lips. "Likewise?" Curious, he asked, "What are you doing in this booth?" Liz leaned back slightly, resting her hands on the desk. "I work as a court reporter," she explained. "I spend my days in courtrooms, transcribing everything that's said. It helps me understand people, what they mean, what they hide, and how to spot when someone isn't telling the truth." Claude listened closely, intrigued. "That's interesting. I work with numbers at Bissell, keeping track of what moves, what doesn't. Lately I've been trying to understand why people choose one thing over another. I suppose we both spend our time watching what words really do." Liz nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it's not just the words," she said. "It's how people carry them." They spoke for a few more minutes, quietly trading observations. Claude found the heaviness in his mind softening as they talked. There was something steady about her, measured, observant, unhurried. It made space for him to think. As the light began to fade and the fair wound down, Claude hesitated. He glanced toward the path that led back to town, then back at Liz. "I know this is a bit unexpected," he said carefully, "but would you mind if I wrote to you sometime? I'd like to hear more of your thoughts." Liz considered him for a moment, then gave a small knowing smile. She pulled a scrap of paper from her desk, scribbled down an address, and handed it to him. "But only if it's a good letter," she said lightly. Claude smiled. "I'll try to make it one." Liz paused briefly, then smiled and scribbled her number on a piece of paper, handing it to him. "Here, but only for thoughtful conversations," she said teasingly. Claude chuckled. "Deal." They said their goodbyes, and as Claude walked away, he felt lighter than he had in a long time. Something about meeting Liz had given him a new perspective, and perhaps a spark of clarity he hadn't expected. After his visit to the local fair, Claude's mind was buzzing with a new understanding. People didn't buy the truth. They bought confidence. It wasn't enough for a product to be honest or accurate. It had to feel convincing. It had to matter to the people who saw it. Claude knew he could turn things around, but for that, he would need support and permission from Mr. Halden. Without it, his plan would stay only in his mind, and he couldn't afford to work in secret this time. The next morning, Claude walked into Bissell with determination. He made his way to Halden's office and knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," Halden's voice called. Claude opened the door and stepped inside. Mr. Halden looked up from his papers, his brow slightly raised, clearly wondering why Claude had come to see him. Claude took a deep breath and sat down in the chair opposite his boss. After a moment of quiet, he began explaining his idea. He spoke carefully, laying out how he wanted to run tests on different versions of the advertisement, tracking only the numbers, facts, sales, and results. He requested Halden's permission and a modest budget to fund the plan. It wasn't easy convincing him. Halden's expression was skeptical, his lips pressed together as he listened. Claude spoke steadily, answering every doubt and defending his plan with clarity. Finally, Halden leaned back in his chair and said, "Fine, I'll give you a small budget, but I expect results. No failures. I don't want to see wasted money." Claude's chest lifted in relief. A smile spread across his face as he thanked his boss and left the office. He had accepted that his previous ad hadn't worked, that truth alone wasn't enough. But now, he had a chance to try again, to put his new understanding into action, and this time, he would make sure it worked. Claude learned that truth without confidence can still be ignored, and that ideas, once spoken aloud, don't always stay with the man who thought them first. If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders Season 1. Episode 6, The Code Nobody Sees. It was early morning, and Claude was already at work. The building was still quiet, the halls nearly empty, and the air carried that calm silence that only existed before the day truly began. Claude felt a rare sense of excitement. For the first time, he was about to run proper tests, real experiments that, he hoped, would push sales even higher and finally give him clear answers. Still, a small thought lingered in his mind, refusing to settle. As he often did when something troubled him, Claude reached for his leather-bound notebook. He opened it carefully and wrote down the question that had been circling in his head. How do you measure something you can't see clearly anymore? He paused for a moment, reading the line back to himself. Then, almost impatiently, he closed the notebook. The excitement was too strong now. He didn't want to lose even a single minute. Over the next week, Claude threw himself completely into his work. He began testing multiple advertisements at the same time, convinced that more tests would lead to more truth, and eventually more success. To him, it felt logical. The more data he gathered, the clearer the answers would become. He changed everything at once: headlines, layouts, wording, and offers. Each version was different from the last, and all of them ran together. It was new territory for him, something he had never tried before. Still, Claude pushed forward, certain that this bold approach would finally reveal what truly worked. For now, the numbers were coming in, and Claude believed he was on the right path. After the ads had been running for a week, Claude finally allowed himself to slow down and look at the numbers. He had been hoping to see clear improvement, some sign that all his effort was paying off. Instead, the results felt unclear. Not bad enough to panic, not good enough to celebrate. He told himself to wait a little longer, but the uncertainty stayed with him. It had been almost 10 days since he met Liz. He still had her number tucked safely in his pocket, yet he hadn't called. Work had consumed him completely. Days blurred into nights, and even when he had a free moment, his mind was always somewhere else. Still, the thought of her returned again and again. He wanted to ask her to dinner, but he knew he couldn't just appear out of nowhere. At the very least, he had to call her first. That evening, while he was at home and the sky outside had begun to darken, Claude finally picked up the phone. His fingers hesitated for a moment before he dialed her number. The first call went unanswered. He waited, then tried again. This time, she picked up. "Hello," Liz said softly on the other end. "Hey, it's me, Claude. I hope you remember," he said, unsure of himself. There was a brief pause. "Yes, I remember," she replied. "I thought maybe you'd forgotten you had my number." Claude let out a quiet chuckle. "No, I didn't forget. I've just been busy with work." She said, her tone neutral. Trying to fill the silence, Claude asked, "So, how's everything with you?" "Good," she replied. "Busy. Court has been keeping me occupied." "I figured," he said. "Are you free this coming Saturday?" She didn't answer right away. The pause felt longer this time. Claude could almost imagine her considering whether he deserved the invitation, or whether he would simply disappear again. "Yes," she finally said. "I am." Relief washed over him. "That's great. I was thinking we could have dinner together." He heard a soft laugh on the other end of the line. "That's one way to ask someone out," she said, teasing gently. "Sorry," Claude replied. "I'm not very experienced with these things." "I can tell," she said, amused. "Well," he said, glancing at the clock, "then it's Saturday. I still have some work to finish, so I should let you go." There was a brief silence. "Bye," Liz said quietly, and the line went dead. Claude lowered the receiver and sat still for a moment. Work still waited for him, but for the first time in days, it wasn't the only thing on his mind. Over the next few days, Claude stayed buried in numbers. On the surface, everything looked promising. The figures were rising, and sales had clearly improved, but the reason behind that increase was unclear. Claude tried to understand what had actually made the difference. Which ad, which change, which idea, but every answer led to another question. The confusion bothered him for a moment, yet he pushed it aside. He told himself that growth was growth, and results were what mattered. What excited him more was the opportunity ahead. He was going to present these numbers to the executives. That alone felt like a victory. On the day of the meeting, Claude prepared carefully. He organized charts, arranged his data, and rehearsed what he would say. He believed the numbers would speak for themselves. When he entered the meeting room, it slowly filled with executives. Soon after, Henry and Walter walked in as well. They took their seats and glanced at Claude with looks that felt cold, almost hostile. Claude noticed, but he kept his focus. The meeting began, and soon it was his turn to present. This was rare. Everyone was listening closely. Claude explained the growth, walked them through the figures, and showed the increase in performance. The data was real. The results were real. On paper, everything looked strong. But as he spoke, he sensed something shifting in the room. One of the executives finally interrupted. "How do we know where these results came from?" he asked. Claude froze for a moment. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no clear answer. Another executive leaned forward, clearly unconvinced. The same question hung in the air, unspoken, but shared by all of them. Claude realized he couldn't explain which specific change had caused the improvement. He couldn't prove what worked, or why. The interest in the room faded quickly. The executives stopped asking questions. One by one, they gathered their papers and left the meeting. There was no praise, no discussion, no approval. When the room finally emptied, Claude sat there, staring at his notes. The meeting had ended, and he knew he had failed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. He had made a mistake, one serious mistake. He still didn't know what that mistake was. The meeting room slowly emptied until only one person remained, Walter. That alone felt strange. Claude noticed it immediately. During the meeting, when the executives had lost interest and stopped listening, Walter had been the only one paying attention. And now, while everyone else had walked out, he was still there. "Can I ask you a few questions?" Walter said. Claude was tired, frustrated, and disappointed, but he nodded. He didn't see a reason to refuse. Walter asked about the tests, how they were set up, what was changed, and what Claude was trying to measure. Claude answered honestly. He explained the variables, the different headlines, layouts, wording, and offers. He walked Walter through his thinking in detail, the way he always did when he believed in an idea. Walter listened closely. That, too, was unusual. Normally, he was quick to mock Claude or brush him off, but this time, he said very little. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened, as if he was carefully storing every word. Claude couldn't read what was going on in Walter's mind. He didn't understand why Walter suddenly cared about his logic or his methods. Something about it felt off, but Claude was too distracted to think about it. Right now, his own failure weighed heavier on him. He needed to figure out what had gone wrong with the tests. That problem mattered more than anything else, so he let the moment pass. For days, Claude worked non-stop, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. He reviewed his notes, rechecked the numbers, and replayed the meeting in his head again and again. No matter how hard he tried, the answer wouldn't come to him. When he finally returned to Bissell, he was met with something completely unexpected. The numbers had jumped sharply. Sales were suddenly up. At first, Claude felt a rush of confusion. He hadn't changed anything. He hadn't approved a new plan. So what had caused this sudden increase? It didn't take long for the truth to surface, and when it did, it stunned him. The office was buzzing with excitement. People were gathered around Walter, who looked unusually confident and pleased with himself. Claude overheard employees saying that Walter would soon be presenting his ideas to the executives. His approach, they said, had led to a clear and impressive rise in sales. Claude stood still, trying to make sense of it. How could Walter have done this? He knew Walter well enough to believe that he wasn't the kind of person who came up with original ideas on his own. Soon, another meeting was announced. Even before it officially began, people were congratulating Walter, praising his instincts and his brilliant thinking. Claude watched quietly. He had never received that kind of recognition, no matter how hard he worked or how much effort he put in. Mr. Halden looked proud as he spoke to Walter, clearly impressed by the results. Nearby, Henry stood beside his friend, throwing subtle but sharp looks in Claude's direction. The message was clear without a single word being spoken. Claude had failed, and Walter had taken the win. As Walter began his presentation, Claude felt his stomach tighten. With every ideas and every explanation, the truth became clearer and more painful. Walter was using Claude's logic. Every idea, every principle, even the reasoning behind the test was the same. There was only one difference. Walter had done what Claude hadn't. Instead of changing everything at once, Walter had kept the sales pitch the same and altered only one element at a time, one headline, one phrase, one promise. Then he compared it to the original version. That single, controlled change was what made the results clear and strong. Claude finally understood his mistake. By changing too many things at once, he had created confusion. Walter, on the other hand, had tested patiently and methodically. One change, one result, one clear answer. That was why Walter's tests worked better. What hurt the most was knowing how Walter had learned this. Claude remembered the moment clearly, the quiet conversation after the meeting, when he had honestly explained his variables and testing logic. Walter had listened carefully, asked questions, and said nothing, not because he didn't understand, but because he did. He had seen the flaw and chosen not to point it out. Now, the executives were nodding in approval. They could clearly see where the increase in sales was coming from, and they praised Walter for his sharp instincts and smart testing. No one asked where the idea had originated. No one questioned how he had learned it. Walter had taken Claude's idea and used it correctly. And while the company celebrated the success, no one seemed to care about the way it was achieved, or who truly deserved the credit. Claude sat there in silence, watching the applause, realizing that doing the right work didn't always mean being recognized for it. Claude lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, still thinking about the day's events. The lesson was clear in his mind now. Change one thing, learn one thing. Change two things, learn nothing. But he had made the mistake of trying to change too much at once, and it had cost him. His thoughts churned endlessly as he replayed Walter's presentation and the way the executives had praised him instead. Just then, his mother's voice called from the hallway. "Claude, someone's on the phone for you." He swung his legs over the side of the bed and picked up the receiver. The moment he heard her voice, he knew it was Liz. "Claude, I'm trying to find the restaurant for tonight's dinner," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. Claude's heart sank. He had completely forgotten about the dinner. Work had consumed him so thoroughly that he hadn't even thought about it, but he didn't admit that to Liz. Instead, he quickly gave her the address, trying to sound calm. "It's right here. I'll see you there," he said. Even though he didn't feel like going anywhere, he knew he couldn't cancel. He had invited her, after all, and that was something he had to honor. When he arrived, Liz walked in at almost the same moment. They greeted each other warmly and sat down. Liz started talking about her day, but Claude's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were tangled in the tests, the numbers, and the sting of seeing Walter take credit for his work. "Are you even listening to me?" Liz's voice cut through his fog of thoughts, gently pulling him back to reality. Claude blinked and shook his head. "Sorry, I was just thinking about something," he admitted. Liz didn't push him, only nodded, understanding that he wasn't truly present at the moment. They ordered their food, and as they ate, Claude spoke more about the ad and the testing process. He told her about Walter and how he had used Claude's ideas but changed only one element at a time, turning the tests into a clear success. Liz listened quietly, nodding along without interrupting. She knew his focus was elsewhere, that his mind was still caught in the day's failures and lessons, not in conversation or light chatter. Even though Claude wasn't fully present, Liz stayed patient, letting him share his frustrations. And for Claude, the quiet understanding in her presence was a small comfort amidst the chaos of his thoughts. Claude finally understood the rule he had broken. Change one thing, learn one truth. Change many, and learn nothing at all. But who controls the truth when the method stays hidden? If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders Season 1. Episode 7, The Sermon. It was a quiet Sunday morning. Claude was already awake, sitting in his wooden chair by the desk, a cup of tea resting near his hand. He lifted it, took a few slow sips, then set it back down as if the warmth had done its job. Something was turning over in his mind, the kind of thought that wouldn't leave him alone unless he wrote it down. He opened his leather-bound notebook and flipped through the last few pages, rereading his notes from the week before. Confidence sells. Don't let charm outpace truth. That line still stuck with him. He had believed in it fully, but now, with some distance, he wasn't so sure. Maybe he'd gone too far, chasing the voice of persuasion, too smooth, too polished. Maybe now it was time to strip everything back. Speak plainly. He turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Maybe there's power in quiet plain language too." He paused after writing the question, reading it once more before closing the notebook. Then he stood, took a shower, and dressed with care. A clean, simple shirt, dark trousers, his hair neatly combed, nothing showy, nothing careless. It was Sunday, a rare day when work did not immediately claim him. Most weeks, he was too busy to think about anything beyond numbers and copy, but that morning, he felt a pull to step outside his routine. The church was not far, and for once, he had the time. He reached it within minutes. The doors were open, and inside, a preacher was already speaking. The church was quiet, only a small number of people scattered across the benches. Claude slipped into a seat near the back, careful not to draw attention. Claude kept his eyes on the preacher and listened closely. The room was completely still. No one whispered, no one shifted in their seats. Every face was turned forward, fully focused on the man speaking. What struck Claude was how plain the sermon was. The preacher used simple words, the kind anyone could understand. There was no drama, no raised voice, no emotional pull, just clear sentences, spoken with ease and confidence. Claude glanced around at the people sitting nearby. They looked convinced, calm, almost certain. They weren't struggling to follow the message or questioning it. They were simply listening, understanding, accepting. To Claude, the reason seemed obvious. It's the simplicity, he thought. That's why it works. He stayed for a few more minutes, letting the words settle, then quietly stood and made his way out of the church. As he walked, his mind was already turning the idea over, shaping it into something familiar. Simple words, no decoration, no warmth, just clarity. In that moment, he was sure he had found the source of the preacher's power. It never crossed his mind that something else might be holding the room together, something he hadn't yet learned to see. On Monday morning, Claude went to Bissell as usual, but the routine broke the moment he stepped inside. Someone told him that Mr. Halden had asked to see him. Claude froze in place, one hand still resting on the edge of his desk. No explanation, no reason, just a summons. He tried not to assume the worst, but his chest tightened anyway. Meetings with Holden rarely came without warning, especially not for Claude. He gathered his things slowly, quietly, then walked the length of the hall with his thoughts clicking faster than his footsteps. Had the numbers dipped again? Was someone blaming him for the last campaign? He reached the office and paused outside the door, forcing one long breath before he knocked. "Come in," Halden called. Claude stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of paper and ink. Stacks of folders lined the desk, and Halden was thumbing through them with his usual half-frown. "Have you called for me?" Claude asked, voice measured. "Yes, Claude. Have a seat." He sat, upright, hands folded loosely in his lap, eyes steady but unsure. "I have a task for you," Halden said, not looking up. Claude braced himself. "I want you to draft the new advertisement for the Bissell Carpet Sweepers." For a moment, Claude didn't move. The words didn't land right away. He blinked. "I'm sorry," he began, unsure if he'd misheard. Halden looked up. "You heard me. I want you to write it. Is that a problem?" "No, no problem," Claude said quickly. He felt the breath leave his lungs in a slow, careful stream. The fear didn't vanish, but something warmer began to stir beneath it, quiet, cautious, unfamiliar. "I'm grateful for the opportunity," he added, and meant it. "You want me to draft the ad?" Claude asked, just to be sure. "Yes, Mr. Hopkins," Mr. Holden replied, finally lifting his eyes. I want you to write it. Is there a problem?" Mr. Halden studied him for a moment, his expression serious. "I expect clear results," he said, "not confusion like last time." Claude nodded at once. "Understood." "Thank you," Claude added. "I'll do my best." With that, he stood up, gave a small, respectful nod, and left the office, his mind already racing with how he would approach the ad this time. Claude sat at his desk at Bissell, his chair pulled in close, his hands resting on the edge of the table. He felt excited, but beneath that excitement was a steady pressure. This time, he couldn't afford a mistake. He knew he had to do better than before, cleaner, sharper, without leaving room for doubt. As he straightened the papers and lined up his pens, Claude's thoughts circled back to the sermon. It had stayed with him longer than he expected. The preacher hadn't raised his voice, hadn't told stories. No flair, no tricks, nothing like the pitchman at the fair, just plain words, spoken with calm and certainty. And yet, the room had listened. Claude believed he saw the difference now. Not charm, not exaggeration, just clarity. That's what the sermon had done, and that's what the pitchman lacked. Maybe I leaned too far toward the flash, he thought. Maybe I trusted style more than strength. This time, he would get it right. He would cut everything down to its cleanest shape. Short sentences, plain language, no decoration, no emotion, nothing that could be mistaken for a performance. By the time he read it back, the copy felt bare, stripped of tone, stripped of color, almost clinical. But Claude felt calm as he looked it over. He believed this was the lesson he'd needed all along. As he read it back, he felt a quiet confidence. The sermon had been powerful, without decoration, and he assumed the power came from the words being simple. If it worked for the preacher, he believed, it would work for Bissell too, for customers and dealers alike. Certain he had found the right approach, Claude set the draft aside, ready to send it forward. After finishing the draft, Claude read it once more, slowly and carefully. He could see that the language was very simple, almost bare, but that was exactly what he had aimed for. Satisfied, he sent the ad forward so it could start running as soon as possible. At first, Claude felt steady, almost sure of it. He watched the ad leave his hands and move up the chain, and for a moment it felt like momentum. But later, as he sat alone at his desk, the quiet returned. He picked up the draft again, not to revise, just to hold it. The paper had gone soft at the edges from where his fingers kept finding it. He smoothed it flat, read the first line, then the second. A flicker of doubt crept in. Too plain? Too flat? He shook his head and set it down again. It was clean, honest. That was the point. Still, he didn't push his chair back. He stayed there, staring at the edge of the desk as if waiting for the ad to speak for itself. Nothing did. He told himself it was nerves, just the waiting, nothing more. That night, however, the feeling refused to leave him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the words of the ad in his head. Sleep came late and only in short stretches. By the week, his fears began to turn into reality. When Claude checked the numbers, his heart sank. Sales had dropped. The mood at Bissell shifted quickly. People whispered in the corridors, and conversations went quiet when he walked past. Some didn't bother lowering their voices at all. The comments were sharp, and the blame was clear. Claude understood then that he had made a mistake, and this time, it felt different. This time, he knew people weren't going to brush it off so easily. Claude soon began receiving letters from the dealers, one after another. None of them were encouraging. They made it clear that they didn't like the new ad at all. According to them, it sounded more like a public notice than an advertisement. Customers were confused by it instead of feeling drawn in or persuaded to buy the product. As Claude read through the reports, a dull, aching feeling settled in his chest. He had hoped for a different response, but deep down, he already knew the truth. He had made a wrong call. He began to understand where he had gone wrong. The preacher at the sermon hadn't held people's attention simply because he used simple words. It was his confidence, his certainty, that made people believe him. Claude had copied the surface of the sermon, not its strength. Now he felt lost. He didn't know what his next step should be, and the confusion weighed heavily on him. Looking for some comfort, he decided to go to Ethan's desk and talk things through. As he walked across the office, he noticed Henry and Walter sitting nearby. The moment they saw Claude heading toward Ethan, they leaned closer to each other and started whispering. Henry spoke just loudly enough to be heard. "Some people just can't succeed, no matter how hard they try," he said, followed by a quiet chuckle from Walter. Claude heard it, but he didn't respond. He kept walking, his face calm, and went straight to Ethan, needing at least one person who would listen without judgment. Claude sat down heavily on the chair in front of Ethan, feeling the weight of the last day pressing on his shoulders. "You look really stressed," Ethan said, his voice gentle, as he settled into the chair across from him. "You might have heard about the new ad," Claude muttered, his eyes fixed on the desk in front of him. "Yeah, I saw it. Why did you make it so simple?" Ethan asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and concern. Claude realized even Ethan, who was usually supportive, didn't think the ad worked. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the office falling into the background. Phones rang, papers shuffled. Claude didn't move. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching him. "You look like you haven't slept in 2 days." Claude gave a weak shrug. "Maybe I haven't." Another pause. Then Ethan sighed. "Look, I don't know what happened with the ad, but you're not the first person to mess something up around here. You won't be the last." Claude didn't respond. Ethan added, more gently this time, "Just don't let it get in your head too deep. That's when things go sideways." Claude nodded quietly, taking in Ethan's words. He felt a little lighter, knowing he wasn't completely alone in this. The next day, another executive meeting was scheduled. Claude could feel his stomach tighten as he walked into the office. He had no idea what questions they would ask or what they would say, and the thought made him nervous. But he also knew that worrying now wouldn't change anything. He had made a mistake, yes, but panicking wouldn't solve it either. All he could do was listen carefully, take in what they said, and figure out a way to fix it once he had all the information. His mind focused on that thought as he stepped into the meeting room, trying to push aside the tension and fear. When Claude entered the meeting room, all the executives were already seated, their eyes fixed on him as he walked in. The atmosphere was tense, and he could feel the weight of their disapproval even before he reached his seat. Their expressions were sharp, almost hostile. Claude knew he had made a mistake, and it wasn't one they were willing to overlook easily. "What was on your mind when you drafted this ad?" one of the executives asked, his voice firm. Claude paused for a moment, feeling the room's weight pressing down on him. His heart raced, but he knew he couldn't hide or make excuses this time. He needed to face it with honesty. "I thought maybe using simple words would convince the dealers and the customers," Claude said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "but I was wrong." A silence followed. None of the executives seemed eager to accept his explanation or his apology. "You made us sound small," one of them said sharply. Claude felt the words land. He didn't flinch, but something inside him tightened. He understood what they meant. The copy hadn't carried authority, just information, and in their eyes, that wasn't enough. Another voice cut in. "You should stay in your lane," someone muttered from across the table. "Don't try writing another draft again." Claude's stomach dropped. He opened his mouth, trying to explain, to say he'd learned, to show he knew what had gone wrong. But the room had already shifted. Papers shuffled, chairs pushed back. One by one, the executives began standing. Except one, Mr. Langley, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, remained in his seat. He glanced down at Claude's copy, then looked up with something less than anger, and more than disinterest. "So," he said evenly, "what did you learn?" Claude hesitated. Langley didn't press. He just waited. Claude cleared his throat. "That simplicity only works when it sounds certain. Otherwise, it just feels empty." Langley nodded once. "Good. And how do you make it sound certain?" "I don't know yet," Claude admitted. "Then find out," Langley said. "You're not wrong to experiment. You're just not finished learning." And with that, he stood and left. Claude sat there alone, the room half empty now, the harsh words still echoing in his mind, but Langley's too. It had been several days since he last saw Liz, and he decided it was time to meet her again. When they met at the small restaurant they often went to, Claude noticed her warm smile, but he couldn't help being lost in his thoughts. Liz noticed it too, and asked softly, "Claude, what's on your mind? You seem distracted." He took a deep breath and told her everything, the flop of the ad, how he had been influenced by the preacher at the sermon, and how he had thought that using simple words alone was a powerful tool for persuasion. He explained how he had applied that idea in his ad, only to see it fail. Liz listened quietly, her eyes steady on him. When he finished, she leaned back slightly and said, "Claude, preachers don't win people over just by using small words. They win them by believing in every one of them." Claude felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew she was right. He had focused on words, not belief, not confidence. Her words made him see where he had gone wrong. After that, the tension between them eased, and they continued their conversation, this time laughing and talking about other things. Claude now saw the structure beneath success, quiet, deliberate, and visible. But the company only saw results, not the discipline behind them. How long can the code stay hidden before someone bends it? If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders Season 1, Episode 8. The Housewives' Hour. The ad was already rejected before Claude finished explaining it. He could see it in the way the senior manager's eyes moved, not reading the pages, just scanning them, the way you scan something you've already decided about. The other two men in the room had the particular stillness of people waiting for a meeting to end. Nobody leaned forward. Nobody asked a question. One of them had his pen flat on the table, which was the physical language of a man who has no intention of writing anything down. "We can't run this," the senior manager said. Claude kept his voice level. "If you read it through, we've read enough." He slid the pages back across the table with 2 fingers, the way you return something that doesn't belong to you. "We appreciate the effort." Nobody in the room looked like they appreciated the effort. Claude picked up the pages and left. He had known, starting it, that this one was different. It had begun 4 days earlier, the morning after Mr. Holden sent him back to rewrite the sweeper ad, the one that had read like a parts list, drained of everything that might make a person feel seen. Claude had gone home that night and sat at his desk for a long time, not writing, just thinking about what Mr. Holden had said. "Write it for the woman who's going to use the sweeper, not for me." The problem was that Claude had been writing for Mr. Holden, or for the executives, or for some imagined composite reader who existed nowhere in particular. He had been writing for the room where ads were approved rather than the rooms where they would land. The housewives, the actual women who ran Bissell Carpet Sweepers across actual floors in actual houses, had existed in his drafts as a category, not as people. He decided to go find them. He spent a morning making a list of women from previous customer correspondence, names and addresses pulled from warranty cards and complaint letters that had come through the company's mail over the past 2 years. He picked 12 at random, spread across 3 neighborhoods, and the next morning he put on his coat, picked up his notebook, and went. The first door was answered by a woman in her 40s, with flour on her apron, and a child balanced on her hip. She looked at Claude with the calibrated suspicion of someone who has answered enough doors to know that what comes through them is rarely as useful as advertised. He explained that he worked for Bissell and wanted to ask about her experience with the carpet sweeper. Not to sell her anything, just to understand. She looked at him for a moment. "You'd better come in then," she said. "The baby just went down." Her name was Mrs. Gallagher. She had owned the sweeper for 2 years. She used it every morning before her husband left for work, and again in the afternoon if the children had been eating in the parlor, which they were not supposed to do, but did anyway, because she had decided that was a battle not worth fighting. She showed Claude the sweeper, a mark on the handle where she'd dropped it down the stairs once, a small repair she'd made to the catch with a piece of wire. She talked about it the way people talk about objects they have a relationship with the specific intimacy of daily use. "The noise is my main complaint," she said. "Not terrible, but this model is quieter than my last one, and that matters more than you'd think when you've got a sleeping baby upstairs." Claude wrote that down. At the next house, a woman named Mrs. Chen told him she had bought the sweeper because her mother had owned one, and she trusted that more than any advertisement she had ever read. "Ads tell you what something is," she said, without particular bitterness. "They don't tell you what it's like to use it every day." He wrote that down too. By the 6th house, he had stopped asking his prepared questions and started listening instead, really listening the way the preacher had listened to his congregation, with the assumption that what people said about small things was often about larger things. The women talked about the sweeper, but they also talked about their mornings, about the window between getting the children fed and getting them dressed when the floor needed to be done quickly and quietly, about the particular satisfaction of a clean room before the day took it apart again, about the things they wanted from their homes that nobody had ever thought to ask them. One woman, Mrs. Patton, on the 3rd Street, with a garden visible through the kitchen window and a cup of tea she had made for both of them without asking, said something Claude wrote, and then underlined, and then put a box around. "I just want to feel like I'm keeping up," she said. Not ahead, just keeping up. Is that too much to ask? He read the sentence back after he left her house and stood on the pavement in the November cold for a moment with the notebook open in his hands. That was it. That was the whole thing. Not the sweeper's features, not its quiet motor, or its durable bristle plate, or its sleek new handle. The feeling of keeping up, the small, entirely reasonable ambition of a woman who wanted one part of her day to be manageable. He wrote the ad that night. It was the best thing he had produced since joining Bissell. He knew that the way you know when something is true, not because you've checked it against a standard, but because it rings at a frequency you recognize. The copy was not long. The headline was direct, but inside it were the voices of Mrs. Gallagher and Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Patton and 6 other women whose names were now in the margins of his notebook, and the ad sounded the way they had sounded. Honest, tired in the good way, asking for nothing unreasonable. He had submitted it that morning, feeling something he was not accustomed to feeling about his own work, not hope. He had hoped before, and hoped wrong. Something quieter, confidence. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes. Claude walked to the small cafe 2 streets from the office where he sometimes went when he needed to think somewhere that wasn't his desk. He ordered coffee and sat by the window and looked at the rejected pages for a while. The ad was not wrong. He was certain of that. It had been rejected not because it failed, but because it was unfamiliar, because the management had no framework for an advertisement that sounded like a person rather than a company, and unfamiliarity reads as risk to people whose job is to avoid risk. He understood this. Understanding it did not make it less frustrating. He was still sitting there when Liz came through the door. She was in her work clothes, the dark jacket she wore to court, hair pinned back with the precision she adopted for professional mornings. She stopped when she saw him, read his expression in approximately 1 second, and came over without being asked. "What happened?" she said, sitting across from him. He slid the pages toward her. She read them, actually read them, not scanning, not performing interest, reading with the focused attention she brought to documents that mattered. Claude watched her face while she did. When she finished, she set the pages down and looked at him. "This is good," she said, not consolingly, factually. "They rejected it." "I can see that." She turned back to the first page. "Who did you write it for?" "The women who use the sweeper." "Did you talk to them?" 12 of them, over 2 days. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. "And the managers who rejected it, have they ever used a carpet sweeper?" Claude hadn't thought about it in those terms. The simplicity of it almost made him laugh. "No," he said, "probably not." "Then they don't know what they're looking at," Liz said. "That's not the same as the ad being wrong." He looked at her across the table. She had the quality, in moments like this, of making things slightly easier to hold, not by removing the weight, but by helping him distribute it differently. He did not always tell her this. He was aware that was something he should work on. "Can I keep this?" she asked, tapping the pages. "Why?" "Because someday you're going to want to remember that your best work was rejected in 11 minutes, she said. "And I want to be able to show it to you." He went back to his desk and sat with the notebook open to the page of underlined sentences from Mrs. Patton's kitchen. "I just want to feel like I'm keeping up, not ahead, just keeping up." The management hadn't been moved by it. That was true, and it was going to stay true, and there was nothing useful in arguing with it. But the women had said what they said, and Claude had heard it, and whatever the company did with the information, it was now in his notebook permanently, and he was not going to stop knowing it. He thought about the preacher again, the way he had spoken, as if the people in the room had already told him something, as if he was simply giving back what they had confided. You could not do that without first listening. You could not fake the listening. People heard the difference immediately, even if they couldn't name it. Claude had spent months learning to write ads. He was beginning to understand that the writing was the last part. The first part was the door you knocked on, and the kitchen you sat in, and the cup of tea you accepted from a woman who had a sleeping baby upstairs, and 15 minutes before her day reassembled itself around her. He opened to a fresh page, and wrote it down before he forgot the way it was forming. You cannot write for someone you haven't listened to. He looked at the sentence, added one word. You cannot write well for someone you haven't listened to. Then, he crossed out well and put the original back. The first version was right, the second was polite, and politeness was the enemy of precision. He closed the notebook. Outside his window, the city was doing its afternoon thing, coats and hats moving in the cold light, the particular energy of a Tuesday that doesn't know it's being observed. Claude thought about Mrs. Patton and her garden and her cup of tea and the clear-eyed reasonableness of what she had asked for from her days. He thought he would try again. Claude had filled his notebook with the real words of real women, their frustrations, their routines, the quiet pride they took in a clean floor. He had written an ad that sounded like life instead of a sales pitch, and the management had rejected it without giving it a single day to prove itself. The ad had died quietly without ever reaching the people it was written for. Would Claude's best idea go with it? Don't miss episode 9, where a company ad earns all the praise and moves none of the product, and Claude starts to understand what people are actually buying. If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders Season 1, Episode 9, The Factory Ad. So, we're advertising to ourselves. Ethan said it simply, the way he said most true things, without drama, without particular emphasis, as if he were reading something aloud that had been written on the wall the whole time. He was looking at the illustration of the sweeper's internal mechanism, holding the campaign sheet with the focused blankness of a man trying to find something to say about it. Claude said nothing. He had been sitting with the same thought for 3 days without finding language that plain for it. We're advertising to the people who approve the advertisements, Claude said finally, which is not the same person as the one who buys the product. Ethan set the sheet down. You should say that in a meeting. I've said things in meetings. Fair point, Ethan said. It had started the morning after the rejection, after the 11-minute meeting, and the pages slid back across the table, and Liz reading his best work in a cafe and telling him she wanted to keep it. He had gone home and sat at his desk in the particular quiet that follows a disappointment you've decided not to waste, and the question had arrived fully formed, the way the important ones always seem to. He'd opened the notebooks and written it before he could second-guess the phrasing. What are people really buying? He had sat with it for a long time. On the surface, it seemed obvious. People buying a carpet sweeper were buying a carpet sweeper, but that was the answer to a different question. The women he had interviewed had not described purchasing a mechanism. They had described buying back something that had been costing them. Time, effort, the low-grade friction of a morning that never quite ran smoothly. Mrs. Gallagher had talked about the noise and the sleeping baby. Mrs. Shen had talked about trust. Mrs. Patton had talked about keeping up. None of them had mentioned the bristle plate. None of them had mentioned the manufacturing process, or the quality of materials, or the precision tolerances that the creative team's new advertisement spent 4 paragraphs explaining. The campaign had launched a week before Ethan returned from his sister's wedding. Claude had stood at the back of the room and watched the creative team walk the executives through it, panel by panel, and he could see why everyone was pleased. The illustrations were precise. A cross-section of the sweeper's internal mechanism, rendered with the kind of detail that suggested both craftsmanship and honesty, as if the company had nothing to hide and everything to show. The copy explained the manufacturing process in language that was technical without being cold. It named the materials. It described the tolerances. It made the sweeper sound like a small marvel of American industry, which in certain respects it was. The executives nodded throughout. Mr. Holden made a note on his pad. Someone used the word distinguished. Someone else said exactly the right tone. Claude looked at the illustration of the sweeper's internal mechanism and thought about Mrs. Patton's kitchen and the things she had said about keeping up, and he kept the thought to himself. The campaign ran for 3 weeks. He checked the numbers at the end of the first week with the specific attention of someone who has a theory they want confirmed and is not entirely sure they want it confirmed. The numbers were flat, not catastrophically. The sweeper was not losing ground. But the advertisement that had been called distinguished and praised for its exactly right tone was producing results that were, by any honest measure, ordinary. He checked again at the end of the second week, still flat. By the third week, the executives had stopped mentioning the campaign in meetings, which was its own kind of verdict. The advertisement had impressed everyone in the building and moved almost no one outside of it. It had done what a certain kind of work always does, satisfied the people who made it without reaching the people it was made for. Claude did not say this out loud. He had learned, at a cost, when to keep his observations internal, but he wrote it in the notebook in the plainest language he could find, because plain language was how he kept himself honest. The ad impressed the company. The customer didn't care how the sweeper was built. She cared what it did for her morning. Then, beneath it, "We are selling the wrong thing." He was still at his desk working through the implications when Ethan appeared. Ethan worked 3 rows away and had the particular gift of making himself comfortable in other people's spaces without anyone minding. He pulled a chair over with the easy familiarity of a man returning to a place he's been before, and sat down with the expression of someone who has been away long enough to find the ordinary interesting again. "You look like you've been here the whole time I was gone," Ethan said. "I have been here the whole time you were gone." "How was the wedding?" Claude asked. "Loud," Ethan said. "My sister cried 4 times, and my mother cried 6 times, and my father pretended he wasn't crying and fooled nobody. The food was good." He leaned back in the chair. "How's the work?" Claude considered how to answer that. "Instructive," he said. Ethan looked at the papers on Claude's desk, the campaign numbers, the notebook open to the pages of housewife interviews. A draft of something Claude had been attempting that was not yet good enough to show anyone. Still fighting for the ads? Still learning from the ones that don't work. Ethan nodded with the particular respect of someone who has watched Claude lose ground repeatedly and is quietly impressed that he keeps treating it as information rather than defeat. They had been friends in the specific way that forms between 2 people who occupy the same difficult environment and have silently decided to be honest with each other about it. Ethan did not always understand what Claude was after, but he had stopped pretending to, which was worth more than false comprehension. Ethan picked up one of the campaign sheets and looked at the illustration of the sweeper's internal mechanism. He studied it for a moment with the focused blankness of a man trying to find something to say. "It's impressive," he said finally. "It is. But..." Claude took the sheet back and looked at it himself. "But the woman who buys the sweeper doesn't stand in the shop thinking about the manufacturing process. She stands there thinking about her floors, her time, whether this is going to be one more thing that makes her mornings harder or one less." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "So we're advertising to ourselves." "We're advertising to the people who approve the advertisements," Claude said, "which is not the same person as the one who buys the product." Ethan looked at him. "You should say that in a meeting." "I've said things in meetings." "Fair point," Ethan said. Claude was still at his desk an hour later when he saw Liz through the window, 3 floors down, moving along the pavement in the direction of the courthouse with the particular purposeful pace she adopted when she was running slightly late. He watched her for a moment before she disappeared around the corner and felt the familiar small guilt of someone who has been better at his work than at his relationship recently. He had been distracted at their last coffee. She had been gracious about it. She was usually gracious, which was one of the things about her that made him want to deserve it. But the distraction had been real, and they had both known it, and he had not yet found the right moment to address it. He would find the moment. He was becoming increasingly aware that moments did not find themselves. That evening, at his desk at home, with the lamp turned to face the wall so the light was indirect and easier to work in, Claude began drafting. He did not start with the headline. He had learned, finally, to distrust the headline as a starting point. It pulled you toward cleverness before you had established truth, and cleverness without truth was the most useless thing an advertisement could contain. He started instead with the question in the notebook. What are people really buying? Then he listed every answer the women had given him, not as quotes, but as distillations. The feelings behind the words, the needs underneath the feelings. Time returned to them in a morning that ran without friction. The confidence of a tool that did what it promised. The small satisfaction of a clean room that stayed clean. The feeling, Mrs. Patton's word, Mrs. Patton's kitchen, of keeping up. He looked at the list for a long time. Then he began to write. This draft did not describe how the sweeper was made. It did not name the materials, or explain the mechanism, or invite the reader to appreciate the manufacturing process. It described a morning, specific, recognizable, the kind of morning that the women he had interviewed would read and feel the small shock of being accurately seen. It described the floor, and the time, and the particular quality of quiet that a well-made tool produces when it does its job without demanding anything extra from the person using it. He wrote it in plain language that was not cold. He had learned the difference, in Mr. Holden's office, between those two things. Plain meant no waste. Cold meant no person. You could be plain without being cold if you kept the person in the room while you stripped everything else away. The headline came last, and it came quickly, the way things come when the work underneath them is solid enough to support their weight. He read the full draft back slowly, then again. It was not perfect. There were 2 sentences in the second paragraph that were doing the same job, and he cut one. The closing line was slightly longer than it needed to be, and he cut the last clause. What remained was tighter than anything he had written before, not because he had removed everything, but because everything that remained was carrying weight. He closed the notebook, turned off the lamp. Tomorrow he would show it to Mr. Holden, not to the management team, not yet, and maybe not ever through the usual channel. Mr. Holden had given him the earlier assignment directly and had told him directly to write for the woman who used the sweeper. He had done that now, properly, with the evidence of 12 kitchen conversations behind him. If anyone was going to see what that produced before the committee got to it, it should be the man who had asked for it. He went to bed with the specific kind of tiredness that comes from work that went somewhere. Not exhaustion, completion, the feeling of a day that added something rather than just consuming it. Outside, the city continued its indifferent business. Floors needed cleaning in 100,000 houses, women with sleeping babies, and cluttered parlors, and 15 minutes before the morning reorganized itself, were going about the unmeasured work of keeping things running. Nobody had written the right advertisement for them yet. Claude thought he might be getting close. The executives had loved the craftsmanship ad. The customers hadn't bought it. Claude was beginning to see the difference between an ad that impressed the room it was made in and an ad that worked in the world it was sent into. People didn't care how something was built. They cared what it changed about their day. Was that insight enough? Or would he need to risk everything to prove it? If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders Season 1. Episode 10. Try It First. It had been a few weeks since Claude helped launch the advertisement promising customers a full refund if they weren't satisfied. The message was clear and straightforward. Buy the carpet sweeper, try it, and if it didn't meet expectations, return it. No questions asked. But the results told a different story. The ad didn't fail because people loved the product too much to return it. It failed because most people never wanted to deal with the return process at all. They didn't want the awkward conversations, the paperwork, or the feeling that they had made a wrong decision. The guarantee existed, but it didn't feel simple or comfortable. It felt like trouble waiting on the other side. Claude had truly believed the ad would help customers feel confident enough to buy. He thought knowing they could return the sweeper would remove their fear, but buyer behavior proved him wrong. People didn't think the way the ad expected them to. That evening, Claude stood quietly by the window of his room, staring up at the sky. His mind kept going back to that failed ad, replaying it again and again. The stars were beginning to appear, and the cool night air filled the room. As he watched the sky, a question slowly formed in his mind. He turned away from the window and reached for his notebook. Sitting back down near the open window, he let the fresh air brush against his face as he opened to a blank page. Without overthinking it, he wrote the question down. Is a guarantee enough to move someone? He stared at the words for a moment, then closed the notebook. Outside, the sky looked peaceful, scattered with shining stars. Tomorrow would be another workday, another chance to find answers. With that thought, Claude closed the window, turned off the light, and went to bed, still thinking about the question he had written. The next day, Claude went to work with a clear idea in his mind. He felt strongly about it. He believed the plan could work, but he also knew he couldn't move forward without support and permission. So instead of keeping it to himself, he decided to take the risk and speak to the management team. Claude asked for a meeting. Just a few minutes, he said. Enough to explain an idea he'd been working through. The managers exchanged glances, clearly reluctant. Some barely looked up from their papers. After all, the last few ideas he'd brought them hadn't exactly inspired confidence. We're already reviewing next quarter's campaign, one of them said flatly. I understand, Claude replied, his voice steady, but I think this can solve the problem we're seeing now. The guarantee isn't working, and we all know it. There was a pause. Then, grudgingly, someone gestured toward a chair. All right, the man said. You've got 5 minutes. Go. All right, one of them said, leaning back in his chair. Tell us what your plan is. Claude took a deep breath before speaking. I think instead of offering a money-back guarantee, we should allow customers to try the sweepers for free, he said calmly. Let them use the product in their own homes. If they like it, they'll choose to buy it. If they don't, they can return it without any pressure. As he spoke, 2 members of the management team exchanged glances. The look on their faces made it clear they thought the idea was unrealistic, almost foolish. We can't trust customers like that, one of them said firmly. They'll take the sweepers and never pay for them. Claude tried to explain further. He talked about trust, about removing fear from the buying process, and about how people behave when they feel respected instead of pressured, but convincing them wasn't easy. The management saw only risk, loss of products, loss of money, and loss of control. To them, the plan sounded dangerous. In the end, they made their decision clear. They weren't ready to trust customers, and they weren't willing to take the chance. Claude's idea was rejected without much room for discussion. Claude left the meeting, knowing he had done his best, but also knowing that the real challenge was only beginning. Even though Claude's idea was rejected, he wasn't ready to give up. The refusal stayed with him, but instead of letting it break his spirit, it pushed him to think harder. He knew deep down that doing nothing was not an option. Accepting defeat would mean losing everything he had worked for, and he simply wasn't willing to let that happen. After thinking for a long time, Claude decided to take another path, one that was not only difficult, but also risky. He understood the danger involved, yet he also knew that this was his only chance. If he let this opportunity slip away, there would be nothing left for him to fight for. His decision didn't come easily, but once Claude made it, he moved fast. The very next morning, before he could talk himself out of it, he quietly arranged for 2 carpet sweepers to be shipped out. No approvals, no signatures, no one at Bissell, not even Halden, knew what he was doing, and that was the point. He met with 2 dealers he trusted, pulling them aside in the back room of the shop, speaking in a low voice. His instructions were clear. Don't try to sell the sweepers. Just lend them out. Let customers take them home. Let them try them, freely, without pressure. No paperwork, no promises. If they liked it, they'd come back to buy it. If not, no harm done. The dealers looked at him like he was half brilliant, half mad, but they agreed. Before he left, Claude paused at the door. He turned back, more serious than before. This has to stay quiet, he said. If anyone at Bissell finds out, I could lose my job. The men nodded. They understood. As Claude walked back toward the street, his pulse was loud in his ears. He knew exactly what kind of risk he was taking. This wasn't bending the rules, it was breaking them. But he also knew the truth. If he wanted to prove what really worked, he couldn't wait for permission. Sometimes, the only way forward was to move while everyone else stood still. During the process, Claude came to an important realization. A guarantee still felt like a business deal, something formal and distant. A trial, on the other hand, felt like trust. If he truly wanted people to understand the product, he had to trust the customers first and give them the freedom to experience it on their own. Only then could they make an honest decision. That understanding made his risk feel more meaningful. One night, while talking to Liz, Claude finally opened up and told her about the bold step he had taken. As he explained everything, her expression changed from curiosity to shock. Are you sure no one at your company will find out? She asked, clearly worried. She couldn't believe how far he had gone, or how risky his decision was. I'm trying my best to make sure nobody finds out, Claude replied quietly. I just have to make sure the customers pay for the sweepers before anyone at Bissell notices what I've done. Liz paused for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, that actually sounds like a good idea, she said. I really hope they like your product and decide to pay for it. After that, they slowly shifted the conversation to other things. Neither of them wanted the night to be consumed by stress and work. They talked about lighter topics, letting the tension fade, enjoying the comfort of each other's company instead. Almost a week had passed since Claude had handed out the sweepers to some housewives for the trial, and he still hadn't heard anything from them. He was starting to get a little anxious, knowing he needed to check on how things were going. To get a clear picture, he decided to visit the dealers who had received the sweepers to distribute to the housewives. Claude walked into the local shop where the dealers were waiting. The familiar smell of polish and cleaning supplies filled the air as he approached the counter. He greeted them and got straight to the point, asking about the sweepers he had sent out. The dealers told him that the housewives were still using the sweepers and hadn't returned any of them yet. Claude felt a mix of relief and worry. On one hand, the fact that the sweepers hadn't been returned suggested that the housewives were enjoying them. On the other hand, he now faced the delicate task of collecting payment or getting the products back without alarming anyone, especially Mr. Halden. It was risky. He knew he had to approach the housewives carefully, politely asking them to pay for the sweepers, while also confirming that they were satisfied with the product. Their continued use of the sweepers was a good sign. It meant they liked them, but he couldn't ignore the responsibility of making sure the trial ended properly. Claude realized this was going to be a test of both tact and persuasion. Claude knew very clearly that he couldn't force the housewives, or any customer, to buy the sweepers. His only option was to be honest, polite, and persuasive while encouraging them to pay for the products. He also knew he had to act quickly. The longer he waited, the higher the chance that Mr. Holden might find out about the trial, and that could cause serious trouble. With a determined mindset, Claude set out to visit the houses where the sweepers had been left. At the first house, he knocked gently on the door. A woman opened it, her face curious but welcoming. "Hello, I'm Claude from Bissell," he said with a friendly smile. "You received one of our carpet sweepers. I wanted to check if you're happy with it and if you'd like to buy it." He spoke respectfully, making sure not to sound pushy. The woman smiled back, nodding appreciatively. "Yes, it's wonderful. It makes cleaning so much easier," she said. "I'd be happy to buy it." Claude felt a wave of relief and quiet satisfaction as she handed him the payment. It was a good start. Encouraged by this success, he continued on, visiting the other houses with the same patience and politeness. Claude continued visiting the remaining houses where the sweepers had been left on trial. At each doorstep, he greeted the housewives warmly and asked about their experience with the sweeper. Many of them were delighted and happily paid for the product, sharing how much easier it had made their daily cleaning. Their smiles and gratitude gave Claude a quiet sense of satisfaction. His idea was working. However, not every visit ended with a sale. A few housewives politely told him that, even after using the sweeper for a week, they weren't satisfied and didn't want to purchase it. It was a hard moment for Claude to accept. Part of him wished everyone would love the product, but he reminded himself that this was exactly why the trial had been part of his plan. If someone didn't like the sweeper, they shouldn't have to pay for it. He accepted their decision gracefully, understanding that honesty and trust were the key, even if it meant fewer immediate sales. By the time Claude returned to Bissell, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the office floor. He realized he had managed to sell several sweepers through the trial, even without the management's approval. He didn't feel the need to report it to Mr. Halden immediately, though he knew Halden might eventually find out. What mattered most to Claude was that the plan had worked. Seeing the results firsthand gave him a sense of quiet confidence. His strategy had succeeded, and he no longer felt anxious or afraid. It was almost late at night, but Claude still had some work to finish at Bissell. The office was quiet, the hum of the lights and the faint tapping of keyboards the only sounds around him. As he was sorting through papers at his desk, he suddenly noticed someone walking toward him. To his surprise, it was Liz. She was holding a small basket in her hand, and seeing her there at this hour made him momentarily forget about his work. "What are you doing here?" he asked, standing up quickly as she reached his desk. "I thought I'd bring you dinner," she said softly, a small smile playing on her lips. Claude felt a warm blush rise to his cheeks at the thought. Liz had brought dinner just for him. "You shouldn't have done this," Claude said, as Liz set the basket down on his desk. "I was almost finished." His voice was gentle, but even he could hear the mix of guilt and surprise in it. Liz gave a half smile and sat down across from him. "That's exactly why I did it," she said. "You haven't been eating properly. I figured you'd forget dinner altogether." Claude blinked, unsure what to say. No one had brought him dinner before, not like this. He opened the basket and found 2 neatly packed sandwiches, still warm, and a thermos of something that smelled like tea. He didn't speak, but she could tell he was touched. "You're allowed to stop working for 15 minutes, she said, teasing, then added softly, "especially when someone shows up just to see you." Claude set his pen down. "All right," he said, quieter now. "Let's eat." They sat together under the soft buzz of the office lamps, the rest of the building nearly empty. Their conversation was light. Fragments of their day, a story about Ethan, a case Liz had nearly lost, and then won. Claude listened more than he spoke, and for once, he wasn't distracted by unfinished tasks or ideas waiting to be tested. He was just there. When they finished eating, he packed away the last few papers on his desk, while Liz waited, her chin resting in her palm. She didn't rush him. Later, as they walked together to her car in the cool evening air, Claude looked over at her and said, "You didn't have to do all that." "I know," she said, unlocking the door, "but I wanted to." He watched her drive off before turning back toward the streetlight-lit path home, the warmth from her gesture still lingering long after she was gone. Claude realized persuasion could be built, refined, and repeated, but repetition without conscience carried its own danger. When does persuasion stop informing and start controlling? If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders, Season 1. Episode 11, The Telegram. Claude sat at his desk in the Bissell office, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the workday. Papers shuffled from desk to desk, typewriters clicked steadily, and small conversations floated through the air. A few workers laughed quietly at something a colleague had said, while others stayed focused on their tasks. It was an ordinary day, no different from the many that came before it. Claude, however, barely noticed the noise around him. As usual, his attention was fixed on the work in front of him. His desk was covered with stacks of papers, old advertisements, yellowed at the edges, some folded, some marked with notes. These were Bissell's past ads, and he had been going through them carefully, one by one. A few days earlier, a thought had stayed with him and refused to let go. He had started wondering why some ads had performed well, while others had quietly failed, even though they seemed strong on the surface. Instead of guessing, he decided to look back and study the evidence. He wanted to understand what actually worked, not what people thought should work. The task was slow and demanding. Some of the ads were years old and hard to locate. Others blended together, using similar language and ideas, yet producing very different results. Claude began separating them into groups, ads that had done well and ads that hadn't. Then he searched for patterns. What did the successful ones share? What was missing in the ones that failed? He leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes moving from one page to the next. He knew that if he could find the real reason behind those successes, he wouldn't have to rely on luck or approval anymore. He could create ads with intention. Ads that worked because they spoke to people in the right way. And if he understood that truth, he believed he could do better, not just for himself, but for Bissell as well. Claude was still sifting through the old advertisements when a familiar pressure stirred in his chest. Not anxiety exactly, but something like it. A signal, almost. A question had begun to press at him, urgent and sharp. He didn't chase it. It had already arrived, fully formed, and it was tied directly to the patterns he'd been seeing in the papers spread across his desk. He reached into his bag, pulled out his notebook, and opened it without hesitation. Leaning forward, he began to write. A few seconds later, he paused, read the line once, and underlined it. What makes people stop and listen? He leaned back in his chair and stared at the words. The ads that had succeeded weren't just well written. They were the ones people actually stopped for. People noticed them. They read them instead of skipping past. That realization left him wondering what had caused that pause. What made someone slow down, even for a moment, and pay attention? Claude knew he had to find the answer. If he understood what pulled people in, he could recognize the pattern behind successful ads. And once he saw that pattern clearly, he could use it again, this time with intention, to create ads that truly worked and brought real results for Bissell. By the time evening settled in, Claude had finished reviewing every advertisement he could get his hands on, some brittle with age, others still crisp from the last year. His eyes burned from the strain, but his mind felt clearer than it had in days. Patterns had begun to surface. One conclusion, in particular, refused to be ignored. Many of the ads that failed were long and detailed. They had heavy headlines, full of explanation. Even though the writing itself was good, people praised them, but they didn't sell. On the other hand, the ads with short, sharp headlines had performed far better. They caught attention quickly and led to strong sales. For Claude, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The evidence was right in front of him. Short headlines didn't just look better on the page, they worked better. And for the first time that day, he felt like he was getting closer to something important. Over the next few days, Claude visited several shops to quietly observe how people interacted with advertisements. He stood nearby, pretending to browse, while his attention stayed fixed on the customers. What he noticed surprised him, but at the same time, it made perfect sense. Most people didn't stop for long. They glanced at an ad for only a few seconds, sometimes even less, before moving on. Hardly anyone took the time to read the full text. Instead, their eyes went straight to the headline. If it didn't catch their interest immediately, they walked away without looking back. That was when the truth became clear to him. People didn't read ads the way writers imagined they did. They didn't start at the top and work their way down, absorbing every line. They glanced at the headline, maybe the first sentence, and moved on if nothing caught their attention. It wasn't that the long ads were poorly written. Some were excellent, even clever, but they failed because they asked too much. Time, focus, patience, and most customers simply didn't have any to spare. Claude saw the pattern now, as clearly as the numbers on a page. The successful ads all had one thing in common: short, sharp headlines. Lines that reached out and grabbed you before you had a chance to look away. A headline, he realized, had to work like a telegram: short, urgent, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't there to explain. It was there to interrupt, to land like a message that couldn't wait. With that in mind, he knew it was time to run a test. The evidence was there in the files, and now in front of his own eyes. People gave an ad a few seconds at most. Those seconds had to matter. So instead of trying to explain everything, Claude focused on saying one strong thing, one clear benefit, something that would stop a person mid-step and make them care. It wasn't about depth, it was about impact. And now, finally, he understood how to deliver it. Claude decided it was time to put his observations into action. He set himself to the task of creating several test ads, determined to see if short, powerful headlines could actually influence customers. For the next few hours, he was completely absorbed in his work, carefully crafting 5 different ads, each with a headline designed to grab attention in just a few seconds. He knew that if he could convince a customer in that brief moment, the chances of making a sale would be much higher. One headline stood out as he wrote it: "This cleanse in 5 seconds." Claude read it again, then again, each time imagining a hurried customer pausing just long enough to catch those 5 words. No build-up, no explanation, just a promise. He moved through the rest of the drafts with the same focus, sharpening each headline until it felt like it could stand on its own. Each one was short, direct, and built around a single clear benefit. He wasn't trying to impress anymore. He was trying to interrupt, to stop someone mid-thought, mid-step, to make them care. When he finished, Claude sat back in his chair. The room was quiet. For once, the work didn't feel like guesswork. It felt like a signal, finally sent in the right language. Just as he was reviewing the final drafts, his phone rang. It was Liz. She asked if they could meet. Claude felt a pang of guilt. He wanted to see her, but he was in the middle of something important. He politely explained that he was busy and asked if they could meet later. On the other end of the line, Liz understood, but she felt a quiet hurt. She could sense that Claude was giving most of his attention to work again, and it stung her a little, even though she didn't say much. She simply told him they would meet later and ended the call. Claude went back to his ads, unaware that the small pause in their connection had left a subtle mark, but determined to finish his work perfectly before he could see her again. In the following weeks, Claude kept a close eye on the sales, and he was thrilled to see the numbers steadily rising. The short, impactful headlines were clearly making a difference. He realized that these concise headlines had become a guideline for success. Finally, the ads he created were performing better than the old ones, and Bissell's products were selling more. Claude felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For the first time in a long while, he was truly making an impact on the company's success, and it gave him a boost of confidence. One afternoon, he visited a local shop to check on the ads in action. He overheard customers reading the headlines out loud, repeating them almost like a chant. The dealers were also repeating the lines to other customers, emphasizing the benefits. Claude couldn't help but smile. He realized that the short headlines weren't just catching attention, they were memorable. Customers could say them, understand the benefits immediately, and feel convinced to make a purchase, especially the one that read, "It cleans in 5 seconds." Seeing the real-world effect of his work made Claude proud. As Claude's success at work grew, so did the weight on his shoulders. His days blurred into numbers, headlines, and deadlines, each one pulling his focus tighter. Meetings filled his mornings, edits filled his nights, and somewhere in between, time with Liz began to shrink. At first, he didn't notice. He answered her calls, but with one eye on the papers spread across his desk. He showed up to see her, but often late, his mind still orbiting the work he'd just left behind. Liz didn't say much about it. She smiled, asked about his projects, nodded as he talked through ideas. But with every quiet pause, every conversation cut short by a distracted glance, something in her dimmed. She was proud of him, he could see that, but pride wasn't the same as closeness, and though Claude didn't yet realize it, the silence between them was no longer peaceful. It had begun to feel like distance. Claude understood something very clearly now. There was no time to explain everything in an ad. People didn't stop long enough for explanations. You only had a few seconds to interrupt their attention, and if you succeeded, everything else followed. With that realization, he continued using the same approach in his future ads. Short, sharp headlines, clear promises, and once again, the results proved him right. Slowly, the atmosphere inside the company began to change. People who once ignored Claude, or openly criticized him, were now starting to notice his work. They couldn't deny the numbers anymore. His ads were bringing in sales. His ideas were working. Bissell was doing better because of him. But appreciation came with something else too. Jealousy. Some coworkers smiled at him during meetings, yet whispered behind his back in the hallway. Salesmen who once dismissed him now felt threatened, because Claude had become the person behind the company's growing success. He was the one finding smarter ways to advertise, the one pushing results forward, and Claude knew the truth now. The headline wasn't the beginning of the message, it was the door. If people didn't walk through that door, nothing else mattered. One afternoon, as Claude walked through the halls of Bissell, he noticed Walter and Henry standing off to one side. The moment they saw him, their conversation stopped. Then, the whispering began again, low but careless. Claude caught fragments of their words. His name, his ads, his luck. He didn't stop. He didn't respond. He simply kept walking. He had work to do, and he wasn't going to waste his energy on them. At the same time, there were coworkers who genuinely appreciated his efforts. A few nodded at him with respect. Some congratulated him quietly. Yet for every person who admired his progress, there was another who resented it. Claude felt the contrast clearly. Success had made him visible, and visibility had its price. Still, he stayed focused. He knew where he was going, and for the first time, he trusted his instincts more than the opinions around him. Claude was doing well in life. His work was paying off. His ideas were finally being recognized, and from the outside, everything looked like a success. But Liz could see a change in him, one that others didn't notice. Most of the time, his mind was somewhere else. Work followed him everywhere. Even when they were together, which had become rare, Claude was only there physically. Liz could tell by the way his eyes drifted away during conversations, by the pauses where he seemed to be thinking about headlines, sales numbers, or his next ad instead of listening to her. They still met now and then, but something had changed. Claude would speak about his new ads with excitement, or fall quiet, his mind clearly somewhere else. Liz stayed beside him, listening, nodding, but more and more, she felt like she was waiting for him to return from a place she couldn't follow. The closeness they once shared had grown faint, like a voice fading at the end of a phone line. It wasn't gone, but it was slipping, little by little, and neither of them seemed to know how to stop it. Liz felt the distance growing between them, and it hurt more than she wanted to admit. She understood that his work mattered to him, and she was proud of his success. Still, the emotional gap left her feeling unseen, as if she was no longer a part of the world that now consumed him. The system now worked without Claude's guidance. Others were using it, faster, louder, and without restraint. What happens when the machine no longer needs its creator? If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.Jaime.com. The Persuaders Season 1. Episode 12. The door he finally opened. Claude was at Bissell as usual, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a busy office, the clatter of keyboards, the rustle of papers, and the occasional footsteps of employees walking past his desk. Yet today felt different. There was a subtle but undeniable shift in the way people treated him. No one interrupted his thoughts mid-sentence, questioned his ideas, or argued with him like they used to. Claude saw the difference immediately. The same coworkers who once interrupted or ignored him now paused when he spoke. They listened. Meetings didn't move on without his input. No one needed to say it aloud. The numbers had already done that. Bissell's sales were rising fast, and everyone knew why. His ads were working. He remembered how easily his ideas had been dismissed in the past, how often he was overlooked. But now, the results were undeniable. Claude had become the quiet force behind the company's success, and no one could ignore that anymore. Suddenly, Claude's thoughts drifted away from the work in front of him. A question formed in his mind, quiet but heavy, and he knew it was not something he could ignore. He reached into his bag, took out his notebook, and opened it carefully. For a moment, he stared at the blank page, then slowly wrote down the question that had been following him. What happens when the proof speaks for itself? He read the words once more, letting them sink in. After a short pause, he closed the notebook, placed it back in his bag, and returned to his work, though the question stayed with him, echoing in the back of his mind. Claude was still sitting at his desk, focused on an ad draft in front of him, when his thoughts slowly drifted back to the past. He remembered the early days at Bissell, the years when he had tried again and again to make the managers, executives, and senior employees listen to his ideas. Back then, he had to fight just to be heard. In meetings, he was often interrupted before he could finish a sentence. His ideas were dismissed quickly, sometimes without even being properly discussed. Many times, it felt like no one believed he was capable of doing something meaningful. Even when one of his ideas worked, there was little to no appreciation. His efforts went unnoticed, and his hard work rarely earned him credit. Yet, despite all of this, Claude never gave up. He kept working quietly, learning more about advertising, studying people's behavior, and sharpening his skills with every failure. Now, things were different. Claude had grown far beyond the person he used to be. He had gained deep knowledge about advertising and understood what truly moved people. Still, he didn't see himself as perfect. He knew there was always more to learn and more room to improve. The biggest change was that he no longer needed to explain himself. The numbers spoke clearly, sales had increased, and everyone at Bissell could see the results of his ideas. He didn't have to convince anyone anymore. His work had already done that for him. People now trusted his judgment because they knew his ideas brought success. Claude had reached a point where proof spoke louder than words, and for the first time, that felt enough. Claude was sitting at his desk, checking the latest sales numbers, when his eyes suddenly moved to the date written at the top of the page. His heart sank. It hit him all at once. It was Liz's birthday. The realization came late, almost too late, and he hated himself for nearly forgetting it. Evening had already set in, but the day wasn't over yet, and he still had time to make things right. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of guilt settle in. It had been days since he last saw her, and now he understood why. Work had taken over his life. Meetings, ads, numbers, everything else had slowly pushed Liz to the side. Claude knew his work mattered, but he also knew this wasn't right. Success meant nothing if it came at the cost of the people he cared about. He couldn't keep ignoring his relationship and pretending it didn't need attention. The thought bothered him deeply. Without wasting another minute, Claude grabbed his coat and left the office. On the way, he stopped at a small flower shop and picked out a beautiful bouquet. Simple, fresh, and thoughtful, just like Liz. Knowing she had the day off, he went straight to her house. When he knocked on the door and Liz opened it, surprise spread across her face. She clearly hadn't been expecting him. Claude smiled, holding out the flowers. "Happy birthday," he said softly. Liz blushed as she looked at him, then at the bouquet in his hands. "You remembered?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost unsure. "Of course I did," Claude said, stepping closer. He pulled her into a hug, one that lingered a little longer than usual, as if trying to make up for all the times he hadn't shown up the way he should have. Not long after, they left for dinner. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew this night mattered, not just because it was her birthday, but because of what it meant for them. The restaurant was quiet and warm, the kind of place where the world seemed to slow down. Soft lights glowed across the room, and gentle music hummed beneath their conversation. Claude sat across from Liz, watching her as she spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't let his mind drift. He simply listened, really listened, for the first time in a while. "I thought maybe you wouldn't have time to come and see me today," Liz said softly, her words honest but not angry. Claude felt that sting of truth again. He knew she was right. Lately, work had taken over his life, and without realizing it, he had pushed her to the side. But this time, he promised himself it would be different. Liz was no longer just someone he liked. She had become family to him, someone he couldn't afford to neglect. Before he could respond, the waiter arrived with their food. Liz's eyes widened slightly as she looked at the table. Every dish placed in front of her was something she loved. She looked up at Claude, surprised and touched. "You remembered all of this?" she asked, smiling. Claude nodded. He had paid attention, even if he hadn't always shown it. Seeing her smile made him feel lighter, almost relieved. After they finished dinner, the waiter returned, this time holding a small cake with a candle on top. Liz froze for a second, clearly not expecting it. "I can't believe you're doing all this," she said, her smile growing wider. "I'd do anything for you," Claude replied quietly. The words made her blush. She leaned forward and cut the cake while Claude sang for her, something he almost never did. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that's what mattered. They shared the cake, laughed a little more, and stayed longer than they had planned, just enjoying each other's company. When they finally left the restaurant and headed home, both of them felt closer, as if a small but important gap between them had finally begun to close. Claude continued his work at Bissell, day after day, quietly pushing the numbers higher with every campaign he touched. His advertisements were no longer just ideas on paper, they were results. Sales kept climbing, and everyone in the company could see it clearly now. There was no debate left, no second guessing. People knew that when it came to advertising, Claude delivered. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of papers on his desk, Claude spotted an unfamiliar envelope. It stood out, clean, formal, and addressed directly to him in neat type. He picked it up, turning it over once, before carefully opening it. Inside was a letter from a cereal company. Claude read it twice to be sure he wasn't imagining it. The message was brief but clear. They were inviting him to visit their office for a meeting. No explanation, no promises, just a polite request for a conversation. Claude leaned back in his chair, still holding the letter. A cereal company, reaching out to him. He couldn't believe it. Before making any decisions, he knew exactly who he needed to talk to. Ethan. Later that day, he found him and handed over the letter. Ethan read it once and looked up, eyes wide. "I can't believe this," he said, grinning. "They probably want to hire you." Hearing it said aloud made everything feel real. Ethan had been there from the beginning, from the days when Claude's ideas were dismissed in meetings, when people barely looked up as he spoke. Through it all, Ethan had believed in him, and Claude had never forgotten that. "I'm going to visit them next week," Claude said quietly. Ethan didn't say anything right away. Then he stepped forward and pulled Claude into a firm hug. "I'm so proud of you, man," he said. "You've come a long way." Claude smiled, the words sinking in. Ethan meant every one of them, and that made the moment land even deeper. The next week, Claude visited the cereal company's office. From the moment he walked in, he felt something different. The way people greeted him, the way they spoke to him, it was all filled with respect, real respect, the kind he had worked for over the years, but had rarely received at Bissell. He was guided into a meeting room where a few senior executives were already waiting. The atmosphere was calm, professional, and welcoming. As the meeting began, Claude mostly listened, and what he heard surprised him. They talked about his work, not vaguely, but in detail. They knew his campaigns, they knew the numbers, they knew exactly how his ideas had helped Bissell grow. "We've been following your work," one of them said. "What you did for Bissell was impressive. You didn't just increase sales, you changed how people think about advertising. We believe in your ability, and we're confident you'd do phenomenal work here. That's why we want you to join our team." Claude sat there quietly, taking it all in. For the first time, he felt truly seen. They understood his strengths, and more importantly, they valued them. There was no need for him to argue, explain, or prove himself. The proof was already there. As he left the building, something felt clear inside him. He was no longer the unsure, hesitant person he used to be. Over the years, his work had changed, but so had he. He was confident now, independent. He trusted his instincts and knew he didn't need anyone's permission to move forward. Claude returned to Bissell later that week, the letter from the cereal company still folded neatly in his coat pocket. The visit had gone well, better than he had expected, and the offer they'd made had stayed with him ever since. It wasn't just a job, it was a chance to be seen, valued, and supported in a way he hadn't always felt at Bissell. He sat at his desk for a long moment, letting the familiar office sounds wash over him. Typing, footsteps, the low hum of voices. But this time, they felt distant, almost like echoes from another part of his life. Claude looked around, quietly taking in the space where he had spent so many years growing, failing, learning, and finally succeeding. Slowly, he stood up. He didn't make a scene. He didn't call attention to himself. But as he began packing his things, his notebook, his papers, a few pens, he moved with careful purpose. And then, from the back corner of his desk, he picked up the small photo of Liz. He paused for a second, his fingers brushing over the frame. He placed it gently into his bag. That was the moment he knew. He was really leaving. As he continued, a few coworkers began to notice. They watched from a distance, whispering in hushed voices, confused. Claude was always one of the last to leave. Methodical, dedicated, dependable. Something about seeing him pack up in the middle of the day unsettled them. But none of them asked why. No one had the courage to interrupt. Claude didn't look up. His decision had already been made. There was nothing left to explain. When everything was packed, he slung the bag over his shoulder and gave the office one last glance. He didn't stop to talk. He didn't make a speech. He didn't wait for applause or recognition. But he did go find Ethan. Claude stepped into the hallway and spotted him near the filing cabinets, as usual, scribbling notes and organizing folders. Ethan looked up and immediately noticed the bag. "You leaving early?" he asked, then paused. "Wait, are you—" Claude nodded once. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm done here." Ethan stood there, surprised, his hand still resting on the edge of the cabinet. For a second, he didn't know what to say. "You're really going," he finally said. "I am." Ethan stepped forward and pulled him into a hug, tight and genuine. "I'm proud of you, Claude, and I'm going to miss you like hell." Claude smiled. "You've always had my back. I'll never forget that." "Write me," Ethan said. "Tell me how it goes. Wherever you land, they're lucky to have you." "I will," Claude promised. They stood there for a moment longer, then let go. Claude turned, walked toward the front of the office, and stepped outside, this time for good. Ethan listened carefully, then smiled, even though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. He was genuinely happy for Claude, proud of how far his friend had come. Still, he admitted that Bissell wouldn't feel the same without him. "You're going to be missed," Ethan said honestly. "People don't know what they'll do without you. You are holding a lot of things together." Ethan also told him that the news of Claude leaving had spread quickly through the office. Many people were shocked. Some were worried. Others were quiet, as if they finally understood how much they had relied on him. Mr. Halden, however, took it the hardest. According to Ethan, Halden regretted everything. He tried to reach out, sending messages through Ethan, asking him to convince Claude to stay. He promised things would be different this time, that Claude would be heard, that he would be valued. But Claude had already moved on. He listened when Ethan told him all this, then gently shook his head. His mind was clear. He wasn't angry anymore, and he wasn't trying to prove a point. He was simply done. And for the first time, that felt right. Claude made a conscious effort to give Liz more time. Even with his busy schedule, he started setting aside days just for her, meeting her at least twice a week. Those moments mattered to him. He wanted her to feel valued, loved, and truly seen, not like someone waiting in the background while work took over his life. He knew relationships don't survive on good intentions alone. They need effort, presence, and time. So he showed up, every time. Liz noticed the change. She could see it in the way he listened to her now, and how he wasn't distracted or checking the time. He was there with her, fully. That meant more to her than any grand gesture. They met for quiet coffees, shared simple dinners, and sometimes went to the theater to watch a show together, sitting side by side and enjoying the calm of being together. Nothing about it was rushed, nothing felt forced. Slowly, they found their way back to each other. They weren't trying to fix everything at once. They were just choosing each other again, and that made all the difference. Claude stood at the edge of what he had built, The method had outgrown the man who designed it, and the final question remained, should it have been built at all? If you enjoyed this story, don't stop here inside the membership. You can follow connected stories every week and unlock full seasons to stay immersed without starting over. No hacks, no shortcuts, just real English over time. Join now at Learn English with Profe.com. The Persuaders Season 1, Episode 13, The Notebook. I don't want to sell people things. I want to make them feel something they didn't expect to feel, and then show them what made them feel it. Claude had read this sentence 3 times before he set the trade journal down. He was in his own office, not Bissell's, not anyone else's, his. 4th floor, Michigan Avenue, a window that caught the morning light in a way that made working before 9 feel like a different activity than working after. The journal had come with the week's post, a thin industry publication he usually read quickly and set aside. He had been about to do exactly that when the quote stopped him. It was attributed to a young woman working somewhere in the New York agencies. The journalist had included it almost as an aside, at the end of a paragraph about talent worth watching. Her name was in the line above it. Claude had not registered the name at first. He had registered the sentence. I want to make them feel something they didn't expect to feel. He knew that sentence, not because he had read it before, he hadn't, but because it was the thing he had been approaching from one direction his entire career, named now from another angle entirely by someone he had never met, in language cleaner than anything he had managed to write about it himself. He set the journal on the corner of his desk and opened the notebook. It was almost full. He turned to the early pages with the careful attention of someone handling something that has earned its age. The handwriting was the same, but tighter than the questions written in the compressed script of a man who wasn't sure he was allowed to take up too much space. He could read the uncertainty in the margins, the corrections, the places where a word had been crossed out and replaced with a plainer one, then crossed out again, as if he had not yet trusted himself to know which version was right. He turned to the page where he had written, "What happens when you test everything and learn nothing?" and sat with it for a moment. That had been a Tuesday morning in a building that smelled of overnight cleaning fluid. He had been trying to prove something to people who would have preferred he didn't. He had been right about the thing and wrong about the method, and the gap between those two facts had cost him more than he could have calculated at the time. He turned another page. Can plain language go too far? He smiled at that one, not at the question. The question was still good, but at the version of himself who had walked out of a church absolutely certain he had understood something, and written an ad so stripped of warmth that Mr. Halden had described it with his particular economy as a parts list. Wrong in a useful direction, at least. Wrong in a way that pointed at the truth rather than away from it. He kept turning. The office had come 6 months after the Quaker Oats meeting, which had led to a second meeting, and then a third, and then a campaign that had done something he had not been certain advertising could do, created a market for a product that had not previously had one, shot from guns. 2 years later, people were still using the phrase, not because it explained anything, because it felt like something, because it had made a stranger in a shop stop in 3 seconds and feel the image in their chest before their mind had agreed to be interested. He had written it in the back of the notebook the night of Liz's birthday, in the restaurant on Fulton Street, talking faster than he usually talked, while she watched him with the expression she wore when an idea arrived, and she had learned to treat those moments as events worth marking. He had married her the following spring. The ceremony was small. Her parents, his mother, Ethan, who had cried with the cheerful lack of self-consciousness of a man who considered crying at weddings a minimum requirement of attendance and not a source of embarrassment. Claude had not cried. He had stood at the front of the room and watched Liz walk toward him with the feeling that something long prepared had finally arrived. Not surprising, not overwhelming. Simply true in the clear and specific way of things that were always going to happen. They had been married for 18 months now. She worked, he worked. They ate dinner together most evenings and talked about their days with the genuine interest of two people who found each other's work actually interesting, which Claude had come to understand was not as common as people implied when they said they wanted it. She brought him tea in the mornings, not because she thought he needed it, but because it was a small version of the larger thing. The regular, unhurried act of being present in someone else's life, which was what marriage was when it was working. He turned to the last written page and read the question he had put there the previous week. Where does a new language begin? He had written it after a meeting with a soap company, a good meeting, the kind where both sides left with more than they arrived with, and had been turning it over ever since. The question was not rhetorical, it was the thing he kept arriving at from different directions, the shape underneath all the other questions he had been writing since the Bissell days. What he had learned to do, over the years since that first uncertain Tuesday, was this. Find the person who was already feeling something that nobody had yet named, and give them the language for it. Not invent the feeling, not manufacture the need. The feeling was always already there, in Mrs. Patton's kitchen, in the woman at the first dealer's shop who had brought the sweeper back to pay for it, in the man at the train station who had picked up the puffed wheat advertisement and read past the headline because shot from guns had stopped him long enough to want to know more. The advertising did not create desire. It found desire that existed without language, and gave it a form precise enough to become an action. That was the whole thing. The code nobody had shown him because nobody had named it yet, and he had spent years at Bissell learning it the long way, through failure and revision and the patient accumulation of evidence that told him, eventually, what the work was actually for. He picked up the pen, held it. He was thinking about the journal, about the woman whose name he had not registered at first, whose sentence he had registered immediately. He thought about Walter, which he did occasionally with a kind of clean and uninvested clarity that had taken time to arrive. Walter had used his logic and presented it as his own and received applause for it, and this had seemed, at the time, like a loss. Looking back, it was the moment the logic had become real, tested in conditions Claude hadn't controlled, by someone who hadn't believed in it and proven to work anyway. The idea had been right independent of him. That was better, eventually, than being right in front of the right people. He thought about Mrs. Patton and her garden and the cup of tea and the sentence he had put a box around in his notebook. I just want to feel like I'm keeping up. He had been writing for her ever since, in one form or another, not for her specifically, for whoever she was in each product, each campaign, each room he was trying to reach, the person who was already feeling the thing and had no language for it yet, the person who would read the right headline, and feel, for a moment, the specific relief of being accurately seen. The young woman in the trade journal was doing the same thing. He was certain of it, reading that sentence again in his mind, but she was doing it from a different starting point. He had come to feeling through evidence, through the 12 kitchen conversations, and the flower on the rug, and the archive of dead campaigns. He had arrived at the human truth by working backward through the numbers. She seemed to be starting with the feeling itself, not as a byproduct of a well-constructed argument, but as the point of departure, the thing you built toward, not the thing you stumbled on after the logic was already in place. He didn't know yet what that looked like in practice. What happened when you put feeling at the center of advertising, rather than as the byproduct of method. He thought it was probably the next true thing. He thought whoever figured out how to do it consistently, at scale, without collapsing into sentimentality, would change what the industry believed was possible. He thought it would be interesting to watch. He thought it would be more interesting to understand. Liz appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, and the particular quality of presence she had, when she was not interrupting, but simply arriving, he looked up. She set his cup on the corner of the desk, where it wouldn't be in the way, and looked at the open notebook. "The last pages," she said. "Nearly." She sat in the chair across from him, the one he kept there for clients, which she used with the easy authority of someone who understood the room was hers as much as his. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Something about where a new language begins." He paused. "And about someone who might already be finding it." She looked at him the way she looked when his mind was somewhere she couldn't see yet, but intended to reach. "Show me." He turned the journal around and pushed it across the desk. She read the paragraph, then the sentence again. She set it down. "She's describing what you do." "She's describing what I arrived at," Claude said. "I think she's starting there." Liz was quiet for a moment, considering the distinction. This was one of the things about her. She did not reach for reassurance when precision was available. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's the next question." He looked at the open notebook, at the blank page after the question. He picked up the pen and wrote slowly, with the care he gave to sentences he intended to keep. "It begins when someone stops performing certainty long enough to listen to what the room is actually saying." He read it back. Added 1 line. The code was never in the words. It was in the gap between what people felt and what they'd been given to say about it. Fill that gap honestly, and the language makes itself. He looked at both lines for a long moment, then he closed the notebook. Not finished? There would be another notebook, probably more than one, and the questions would keep arriving the way they always had. In the early morning, in the middle of other work, on pavements, and in restaurants, and in the back of cars moving through cities, he was still learning to read. The questions did not stop. That was fine. The questions were not the problem. The questions were the work. Liz was watching him. "Done?" she said. "With this one," he said. She stood and picked up the empty cups. "I'll get the tea," she said. "New notebook," he said. She smiled, the real one, and left. Claude sat alone for a moment in the morning light. He thought about the woman in the trade journal. He thought about the sentence she had apparently said in a meeting, and the journalist who had included it almost as an aside, not yet understanding that aside was the wrong word for it. The notebook question was still open on his desk. Where does a new language begin? He thought he was beginning to know the answer. He thought she probably already did. He reached for the fresh notebook on the shelf behind him, opened it to the first page, and wrote the date at the top. Then, he set the pen down and picked up his tea and looked out the window at Michigan Avenue going about its morning business, and waited, with the particular patience of a man who has learned that the best questions arrive on their own schedule, for whatever came next. Claude had stopped asking for permission. He had stopped explaining himself to rooms that weren't ready to listen. He had his own office, his own work, and the quiet certainty of a man who had spent years being right about things nobody thanked him for, and had learned finally that the work was its own reward. But somewhere across the country, a young woman was starting where he had ended up, and she was going to take it further than he had imagined possible. Join us for Season 2, Marketing with Heart, where we follow Mary Wells Lawrence, the woman who didn't just find the gap between what people felt and what they'd been given to say about it, but made that gap the entire art form